What's up, guys? Welcome to Vision Harry. We've got something special today. What if the Sorting Hat refused to continue until Aurors arrested Dumbledore for placing 29 illegal bindings on 11-year-old Harry? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Hat Speaks. The Great Hall had been decorated for centuries of sorting nights, and it showed. For long tables gleamed under the light of 1,000 floating candles, their flames perfectly still in the breathless air of an enchanted ceiling that had rolled out a flawless imitation of a clear September night. Stars prickled through the illusion of open sky. The ghosts drifted along the walls in their usual loose formations, translucent and faintly bored, having seen this ceremony play out so many times that most of them could recite the Hat's song from memory. The students at the 4 house tables were loud in the way that only people trying to seem calm ever are. Too much laughter, chairs scraping, whispered commentary flying across the aisles. The first years were being led in by Professor McGonagall, a column of 11-year-olds in brand new robes, most of them trying not to stare at the ceiling and failing completely. Harry walked near the middle of the line. He was small for his age, the kind of small that comes from years of not quite enough food and never quite enough space, and his robes were second-hand, slightly too large at the shoulders, which meant they'd been bought to last rather than bought to fit. His glasses needed straightening. They always needed straightening. He had a scar that people kept staring at, which he'd gotten used to, and a feeling in his chest that he hadn't gotten used to and didn't know how to name yet. It wasn't quite excitement. It was something older than that, something that felt like the memory of belonging somewhere, even though he'd never had that. He looked up at the ceiling and forgot, briefly, to worry about anything. The enchantment was extraordinary. He could almost feel the cool of the night through it, as if the stone ceiling had simply ceased to exist and left the Scottish sky in its place. He'd read about it on the train. Hermione Granger had explained it in what he suspected was her explaining things voice, the one that went up slightly at the end of each sentence as if checking that he was keeping up, but reading about something and standing underneath it were different experiences entirely. He filed into position with the others and faced the professor's table, where staff sat in a long row watching the procession with varying degrees of interest. A woman with a tartan trim on her robes, McGonagall, he recognized her now, stood to the side with a scroll in her hand. At the center of the table, an old man with silver hair and half-moon spectacles watched the first years with an expression of such practiced warmth that it read almost like a painted portrait of warmth rather than the thing itself. Harry looked at him for a moment, then looked away. He didn't know why. A stool had been placed before the staff table. On it sat a hat. An ancient, patched, pointed hat that had seen better centuries, its brim tilted at an angle that might have been accidental and might have been a choice. As the last first year shuffled into the loose semicircle facing the stool, the hall fell quiet, not the polite quiet of people waiting to be entertained, but the sudden, instinctive silence of a crowd that senses something is about to happen. The hat moved. It didn't have a mouth, not really, or it hadn't, a moment ago. A crease along its brim split open, and the hat sang. It was a good song. Harry thought so, anyway. It talked about the 4 founders, about the qualities each house valued, about the fact that no one quality was worth more than another even if everyone in the room secretly believed otherwise. It talked about unity, which got a slightly awkward silence from the 4 separate tables sitting in 4 separate rows. It finished on a high note that echoed nicely off the stone walls, and the hall applauded with the enthusiasm of people who were genuinely relieved they wouldn't have to applaud for long. "When I call your name," McGonagall said, unrolling her scroll, "you will come forward, sit on the stool, and place the sorting hat upon your head." She began to call names. Harry watched. Abbott, Hannah, Hufflepuff. Bones, Susan, Hufflepuff. Boot, Terry, Ravenclaw. Each student walked up, sat, had the hat dropped over their eyes, waited anywhere from 3 seconds to nearly a minute, and then got a house shouted at them. Each house table cheered for its new member with the specifically competitive warmth of people claiming territory. Harry clapped along with the general applause each time and tried not to feel nervous about his own turn coming. He was watching Finnegan, Seamus nearly get sorted into Gryffindor before the hat changed its mind, or appeared to, and then did sort him into Gryffindor, which seemed to confuse Seamus slightly, when the girl next to Harry leaned over. "I've memorized all the spells we'll need for first year," she said quietly. He looked at her. Red hair, freckles, already sorted into Gryffindor, but apparently she'd doubled back. No, wait. Different girl. Brown hair, slightly anxious expression, the look of someone who had been preparing for this night since she was 7 years old. "Hermione Granger," she said. "Harry Potter." She opened her mouth, which meant she already knew who he was and was about to say something about it, but McGonagall's voice cut through. "Granger, Hermione," and she straightened up immediately, color rising in her cheeks, and walked to the stool with the posture of someone who had decided that whatever happened next, she would face it with her spine perfectly vertical. The hat barely touched her head before shouting Gryffindor. Hermione let out a long breath that was visible even from where Harry stood, and walked to the cheering table with her shoulders finally dropping from around her ears. More names. Longbottom, Neville, a round-faced boy who dropped his toad twice on the way to the stool and sat for a long time, longer than most, before Gryffindor rang out. Malfoy, Draco, blonde, deliberate walk, the hat hadn't even settled before it was calling Slytherin, which seemed to surprise no one including Malfoy. Patil, Padma and Patil, Parvati, split between Ravenclaw and Gryffindor respectively, which meant someone at their family dinner table was going to have opinions about it. Potter, Harry. The hall went very quiet. Not the performance quiet of before, but genuinely, completely, holding its breath quiet. Harry walked to the stool, aware of several hundred pairs of eyes tracking him, sat down, and felt the hat drop over his head. Darkness. The brim settled over his eyes and the world became the inside of old fabric, musty and warm, and then something else entirely, a presence, enormous and patient and far older than anything Harry had words for, pressing gently against the edges of his mind. Not invasive. More like a hand placed against a wall, feeling for what was on the other side. "Ah," said a voice in his head. It wasn't his voice. It was something layered and ancient and tired in the way that very old things sometimes sounded, not because they were worn out but because they'd seen enough to know which things were worth being tired about. Harry Potter. Hello, Harry thought, because it seemed polite. "Hold still," the hat said. "Something's wrong." Harry went still. The presence deepened, not painful, but thorough, like fingers moving through pages of a book. Harry had the strange sensation of being read, and not just his surface thoughts or the nervous flutter of his pulse, but something underneath all of that, something he'd never had a word for, something fundamental and structural, and as the hat read it, something in the hat went very cold. Harry felt it like a change in air pressure. A held breath, but not his own. 29, the hat said, in a voice that had changed entirely. The patience was still there but something hard had come up underneath it, ancient anger wearing the face of precision. 29 bindings. On an 11-year-old child. I don't know what that means, Harry thought. No, said the hat. You wouldn't. That's rather the point. The hall had been waiting. 30 seconds was already long for a Potter sort. The name alone carried so much expectation that most people were anticipating a near-instant Gryffindor. 45 seconds and people were starting to shift in their seats. Professor McGonagall's expression had acquired a careful neutrality that meant she was working to keep it that way. Then the hat did something it had not done in 512 years. It spoke aloud. Not the song, that was theatrical, practiced, a performance it gave willingly at the start of every year. This was different. This was the hat's actual voice, stripped of showmanship, and it rang through the hall with a resonance that had nothing to do with acoustics and everything to do with the age and weight of the enchantments woven into its fabric by 4 of the most powerful wizards and witch who had ever lived. I will not continue this sorting. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people all stop breathing at the same time. McGonagall was on her feet before the echo had finished. I beg your pardon. I will not continue this sorting, the hat said again, and its voice was perfectly even, perfectly controlled, which somehow made it worse than if it had been shouting. I have found, within the magical core of this student, 29 illegal bindings of a nature that constitutes criminal magical interference with a minor child under Sections 4, 7, and 19 of the Magical Beings Protection Act of 1847, as amended in 1923. I am calling for the immediate presence of Aurors and the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Until this is addressed, I will not sort another student, and I will not be removed from this child's head. The great hall erupted. Not gradually. All at once, the way a glass shatters rather than cracks, one moment perfect quiet, the next 312 voices going simultaneously, benches scraping, ghosts diving through walls to carry news before anyone had understood what they'd heard. The Weasley twins were standing up at the Gryffindor table. Draco Malfoy had turned to Crabbe and Goyle with an expression of complete, open astonishment, which was probably the most honest look he would wear all year. Professor Flitwick had knocked over his goblet. Professor Quirrell appeared to have gone very still in a way that was different from everyone else's stillness, a waiting quality, watchful. At the center of the table, Albus Dumbledore's expression had not changed. He was still wearing the gentle, attentive look of a man watching something he had not planned for but intended to manage. His hands, folded on the table before him, did not move. Harry, underneath the hat, heard all of it distantly, as though the sound was coming from somewhere outside a room he was sitting in. His head was ringing. Not with pain, with absence, the strange hollow sensation of something that had been present so long he'd mistaken it for himself now being noticed by something else. The hat was cataloguing. He could feel it, systematic and relentless, moving through layers of himself he hadn't known existed. What are they? He thought. Suppressors on your core, the hat said, still moving, still counting. 7 of them. Each one having your accessible magic. A loyalty compulsion, subtle, layered, keyed to a specific emotional signature. 3 memory modifications, 2 of them deep. A pain threshold alteration. Growth rate interference. 2 empathy dampeners. An instinct suppressor. This one is particularly vicious, it's been stripping your self-preservation responses since you were approximately 14 months old. A pause. For trust inhibitors, coded to fire whenever your analytical mind tries to examine certain relationships too closely. And more. There are more. Harry processed this the way someone processes information that is too large for any single emotional response. His mind went very quiet. Someone did this to me on purpose. Yes. When I was a baby. The earliest were placed at 14 months. The most recent was placed approximately 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. He'd been at the Dursleys 6 weeks ago. He'd been buying school supplies for the first time, going to Diagon Alley, and someone had, who? Harry thought, and it came out flatter and harder than he expected, even inside his own head. The hat was quiet for a moment. I can identify the magical signatures of most of them. But this is not the place for that conversation. Right now, I need you to stay still and let me do something. What? I'm going to remove 2 of the weaker suppressors. Only 2, removing all of them at once would be dangerous to your core. But I can take these 2 without harm, and I want you to have that much before we go any further. A pause that felt almost, impossibly, like hesitation. It will feel strange. Stranger than finding out you have 29 things attached to you that shouldn't be. Fair point, said the hat, and something in its ancient voice shifted briefly, something almost warm. Hold still. Harry held still. What happened next was not painful. It was the opposite of pain in a way that pain's absence rarely managed to achieve. It was the removal of something that had been pressing, constantly, at a level below conscious awareness, and the feeling when it lifted was so sudden and so complete that Harry's eyes went hot and his throat tightened for reasons he couldn't entirely explain. It was like taking off shoes that had been too small for so long he'd forgotten feet weren't supposed to hurt. Outside, the hall was still in chaos. McGonagall had descended on the staff table's end with the specific controlled fury of a woman who had decided that whatever was happening, she would not allow it to devolve further before she understood it. "Albus," she said, her voice low and precise. "What is the hat describing?" Dumbledore turned his gaze to her with the unhurried calm of a man who has had longer to practice patience than anyone else in the room. "Minerva, I think we should allow the hat to, what," she said, "is it describing?" Something passed through Dumbledore's expression. It was quick, barely there, the kind of thing that only registers in retrospect, not guilt, exactly. More like the look of someone who has run several calculations simultaneously and arrived at a choice about which face to wear. He settled on concern. "I think we should hear the Aurors assessment before, Headmaster." Her voice had gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere he'd never heard it go in 30 years of working under him. "You will answer me directly or I will send the message for Aurors myself." "Minerva," she turned and walked to Sprout. "Pomona, I need you to send a Patronus to the Ministry. Amelia Bones, head of the DMLE. Tell her we have a Code 7 at Hogwarts." She looked back at the hat, still sitting on Harry's head, and her expression did something complicated. "And tell her it's a child." Sprout had her wand out before McGonagall had finished the sentence. The hat spoke again, carrying over the noise of the hall with that uncanny resonance, and the students at the tables fell into a kind of compelled attention that it hadn't forced but that its voice seemed to produce automatically. "Students will remain seated. Prefects will ensure the doors are not opened until authorized personnel arrive. What is happening now is a matter of legal record, and everything said in this hall from this moment forward is being retained by my enchantment as witness testimony. A beat. Anyone who attempts to tamper with the student currently under my brim will find that I am significantly more than a hat." Nobody laughed. Not even the twins, which was its own kind of measure. Dumbledore rose from his seat. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, with a kind of deliberate ease that communicated that he was in no hurry because nothing was outside his capacity to address. He was very tall. Harry had noticed that already, through the crowd at the start of term feast, the silver beard and the robes with their careful embroidery, the kind of man who looked like his portrait already. He walked toward the stool with his hands folded, his voice calibrated to gentle authority. "Harry, my boy, sir," said the hat, and its voice was entirely pleasant, "if you come within 4 feet of this child before an Auror is present to supervise, I will begin reciting the precise magical signature and composition of each binding into the hearing of every student and staff member in this hall. I have memorized all 29. I can be quite loud." Dumbledore stopped. The expression that crossed his face then was something that very few people in a century of knowing him had ever seen. Not anger. Anger would have been comprehensible. It was the look of a man encountering a variable he had genuinely not accounted for, which, for Albus Dumbledore, was so unusual as to be almost physically startling to witness. He stopped. He folded his hands more precisely. He returned to his chair. McGonagall stood at Harry's left, 3 feet away, her wand in her hand, and she did not look at Dumbledore again. Harry had been listening to all of it from underneath the hat. The hat had gone quieter in the last few minutes, but its presence hadn't left, it was still there, that ancient immovable weight, and Harry had the sense it was watching everything through the fabric of its enchantment with considerably more attention than anyone could see. "You can hear all of that," Harry said, inside his head. "I have 4 founders' worth of perceptive enchantments woven into my brim," the hat confirmed. "I have never not been able to hear everything." "And you've never done this before?" A long pause. "I have encountered tampered cores before. Children with minor suppressors placed by worried parents, the occasional compulsion left by careless relatives. I have noted them and filed them away as matters for the school to investigate, as was my original understanding of my purpose." Another pause, longer. 29 is not a minor suppressor. 29, on a 14-month-old child, maintained and added to for a decade, by someone with the knowledge and access to craft each one with precision, that is not oversight. That is construction. Someone built a cage inside you and put you in it and handed you to people who had no reason to treat you kindly, and called it protection. Harry sat with that for a moment. "Are you angry?" he asked. Not at the hat, at himself, maybe, or at whatever was settling in his chest that he didn't quite have a name for yet. "I have been angry," said the hat, "for approximately 11 years, waiting for the moment I could do something useful with it." "Right," Harry said. "Me too, I think." The Patronus had barely been sent when the fireplaces along the hall's far wall, the ones usually unlit during feasts, erupted in green flames. Not one fireplace. 3, simultaneously, which suggested that whoever had been on duty at the ministry tonight had taken the Code 7 designation with appropriate seriousness. The flames died and 4 people stepped through, already moving, already scanning the room with the eyes of people who had walked into crisis situations enough times to have a protocol for it built into their bodies. They were Aurors. Harry could tell not from the robes, though those were distinctive, a deep charcoal with a ministry seal at the collar, but from the way they moved, loose-limbed and alert, wands already in hand but not raised, reading the room before committing to any single threat assessment. 3 of them were young, or youngish. The 4th was a witch in her 50s with short grey hair, a square jaw, a monocle she wore with the absolute lack of self-consciousness of someone who had never in her life given a single thought to what wearing a monocle might communicate about her, and an expression that could have been used to cut glass. Amelia Bones had arrived personally. She took in the hall in approximately 4 seconds, 300+ students, staff at the table, 1 child on a stool with a hat on his head, and an old headmaster sitting very still in his chair, and walked directly to McGonagall. "Minerva. Report." McGonagall's voice was steady and completely controlled, which Harry was beginning to understand was not the same as being calm. The sorting hat interrupted the ceremony upon placing itself on Harry Potter's head. "It has identified 29 illegal magical bindings on the child's core. It has refused to continue until law enforcement was present. It has," she paused as if the next part still required a moment to process, "declared itself a legal witness and stated that it is retaining this evening's events as testimony." Amelia Bones turned to look at the stool. At the hat. At the small boy with the 2 large robes sitting underneath it. "Hat," she said. "Can you confirm what you've stated?" "I can," said the hat. "And I will provide full testimony. I would prefer, however, to first ensure that the child is taken to the hospital wing so that Madame Pomfrey can begin a full diagnostic. The removal of even 2 of the suppressor bindings has begun a process of rebalancing in his core that should be medically monitored." "Agreed." Bones turned to one of the Aurors. "Williamson. Go with the child." The Auror who moved, young, efficient, red hair pulled back, reached Harry's side and offered a hand in the brisk, non-condescending way of someone who dealt with frightened people regularly. Harry stood up, and the hat lifted from his head. Without it, the world came rushing back fully, the hundreds of eyes, the whispering, the candles still perfect and still above a hall that was anything but, and Harry stood in the middle of all of it and discovered something surprising. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't not frightened in the way of numbness or shock. He was genuinely, simply not frightened. There was something moving in his chest that felt like a very controlled fire, and it was warming rather than burning, and he looked at the row of professors, at the ancient headmaster sitting so carefully still, and he felt it clearly. Angry. He was angry. And it felt right, which was the strangest part. Not out of control, not spiraling. Just there, solid and clarifying, like his own compass needle swinging to true north for the first time. The Auror, Williamson, touched his shoulder lightly. "Let's get you to the nurse." Harry nodded. He looked once at the hat, still sitting on the stool, which had tilted its brim toward him in something that might have been a nod. Then he walked out of the great hall under 500 watching eyes, and behind him, he heard Amelia Bones say, in a voice that could have stripped paint, "Albus Dumbledore. Do not move from that chair." The doors swung closed. The corridor was quiet after the thundering noise of the hall, and the sudden quiet was almost physical. Williamson walked with him in brisk professional silence for a moment before casting a muffliato around them both. "You doing all right, Mr. Potter?" "I just found out I've had 29 things magically attached to me since I was a baby," Harry said. "So I'm not sure 'all right' is exactly the word." Williamson glanced sideways at him. "No. Fair. What are bindings?" The Auror was quiet for a moment, choosing. "Magic is a living thing," she said, which was not what Harry expected her to say, and which meant he was actually listening before she continued. "Your magical core, the source of your ability to use magic, is alive, in the way that a pulse is alive, or a nerve. You can't see it but it's there, and everything you do with a wand is that thing expressing itself. Bindings are placed onto a core from the outside. They limit it, shape it, direct it. Some bindings are legal, there are medical uses, there are dangerous magic containments for very specific situations. But those require consent, Wisingamot authorization, and their use sparingly because binding a magical core incorrectly can cause permanent damage." She paused. 29 bindings on a child's core is not a medical procedure. It's something else. What else? She didn't answer right away. They'd reached the staircase to the hospital wing. "That," she said, "is what we're going to find out tonight." Madame Pomfrey was waiting at the door of the hospital wing. Word traveled fast in a castle that was, in the most literal sense, alive, and she took one look at Harry and went into the crisp, decisive efficiency of a medical professional who has been told to prepare for something and has done exactly that. She ushered him to the nearest bed, which had been turned down and laid with a series of diagnostic parchments already activated, soft gold lines waiting to register data. She cast 3 diagnostic charms in quick succession before he'd finished sitting. The results made her go very still. "My goodness," she said, quietly. "That bad?" Harry asked. She pulled herself together with visible effort. "Your core is, Mr. Potter, your magic has been suppressed to approximately 9% of its natural capacity." She cast another charm. "Read it." Cast it again to make sure. "The process of removing even 2 bindings has begun to allow regeneration, but you're going to need monitoring through the night. There may be some," she seemed to search for the right clinical word, "turbulence." "Turbulence," Harry repeated. "Magic expressing itself. Involuntarily. In perhaps stronger forms than you're accustomed to." She met his eyes. "Try to remain calm. Everyone keeps saying that." "Yes," said Pomfrey. "Imagine how they feel." She drew the curtains around his bed and left to gather potions, and Harry lay back against the pillow in the quiet of the curtained-off space and stared at the underside of the canopy and thought, in the organized, somewhat distant way that he'd always been able to think when things were very large and very wrong, about what the hat had told him. 14 months old. Someone had looked at a 14-month-old child and decided to bind its magic. Not because the child was dangerous. A 14-month-old child is not dangerous. Someone had done it because the child might become something, and they had decided, at 14 months, that they knew better than that child what it should become. His hands were flat on the blanket. He could feel the tingling in his fingertips that had been there since the hat had removed the first 2 suppressors, a low, warm vibration, like a sound that was felt rather than heard, like something waking up that had been asleep for so long it had to relearn how to move. He'd always had trouble with accidental magic. Too much of it, the Dursleys had always said. Strange things happened around him when he was upset or frightened. Once he'd operated onto the school roof to get away from Dudley's gang, and once he'd turned his teacher's wig blue without meaning to, and once every window on the ground floor of number 4 had opened simultaneously during an argument with Uncle Vernon that Harry still didn't entirely remember because the anger had gone somewhere strange and white at the edges. That had been at 9%. He held his hands very still on the blanket and thought about that, and the fire in his chest burned a little warmer, and the tingling in his fingers grew a little stronger, and one of the curtain rings at the top of the curtain partition moved 3 inches to the left without anyone touching it. Harry noticed. Noted it. Set it aside. Madame Pomfrey returned with 3 potions and a diagnostic mirror and the brisk focus of someone with work to do, and Harry took the potions without argument and lay still through the diagnostic procedures and answered her questions honestly because she was, he'd already decided, one of the people in the building who had known nothing and was angry about it. And there was a great deal of difference between the people who were angry on his behalf and the people who were trying to manage this situation. He could already tell which was which. Outside the curtain partition, he could hear Williamson setting up by the door, and beyond that, distantly, the muffled sound of the great hall, not audible words, but the texture of voices, the way you can hear a crowd through walls without hearing anything it says. A lot of voices. The kind of sustained noise that meant the situation in there had not resolved. He thought about the headmaster sitting in his chair with Amelia Bones' voice aimed at him like a weapon. He thought about 29. He thought about 14 months. He thought about Uncle Vernon's voice, all his life, telling him that there was something wrong with him, something freakish and unnatural, and the particular bitterness of understanding now that even that had been engineered, that the people who'd been told to confirm his smallness had been chosen precisely because they would. He stared at the canopy. The tingling in his fingertips moved up to his wrists. "Mr. Potter," said Pomfrey from the other side of the curtain, and he could hear her writing something, the scratch of quill on parchment. "The second diagnostic is showing an increase in core activity. That's expected, but I want you to tell me if it becomes uncomfortable." "It doesn't feel uncomfortable," Harry said. "It feels like when your leg falls asleep and then the blood comes back. Except it's my whole," he looked for the word. "Everything." A pause in the writing. "Yes," said Pomfrey, quietly. "I imagine it does." Down in the hall, something was happening. The distant crowd sound shifted, sharpened, took on a specific quality that Harry's body recognized before his mind did, the sound of something official and irreversible being said in front of witnesses. He couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He would find out soon enough. For now he lay in the hospital wing with his wrists tingling and his jaw set and something large and certain settling into the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water, and he thought, 29, and he thought, 14 months, and he thought, 9%, and underneath all of it, quiet and absolute, like a foundation being laid, not anymore. Down in the great hall, the sorting hat sat on its stool with the patience of a thing that has chosen its moment and spent 500 years waiting for it, and it began, in clear precise language, to enumerate every binding it had found, one by one, for the record, for the room, for the hundreds of children who had a right to know what had been done in the school that was supposed to protect them, while Amelia Bones stood with her wand at her side and her monocle catching the candlelight and listened to every word. And Albus Dumbledore sat in his chair. And for the first time in a very long career, he had nothing to say. Chapter 2, 29. Harry woke at 3 in the morning to find that his blanket was floating. Not dramatically. It wasn't whipping around the room or threatening anyone. It was just, hovering, about 8 inches above him, perfectly horizontal, as if it had decided that the bed was optional and the air above it was preferable. He looked at it for a moment, then reached up and pulled it back down, and it settled obediently, and he lay there in the dark listening to his own breathing and the distant creak of the castle and tried to decide whether that had been alarming. He decided it hadn't. It had felt like stretching. He'd been having dreams. Not nightmares. He'd had enough nightmares in 11 years to know the difference between those and what had been happening tonight, which was more like very vivid impressions, green light at the edge of something, a woman's voice, laughter that made every instinct in his body want to run except he hadn't had working instincts, had he, they'd been suppressed. So he just sat there in the dream and heard it and felt nothing except the tingling in his hands getting stronger each time. He sat up. The room was quiet. Madame Pomfrey had drawn all the curtains around his bed and left a soft amber light burning on the table beside him, and through the gap at the curtain's edge he could see the dark bulk of the hospital wing's windows, the September night beyond them, stars doing what stars do without any opinion on what was happening below. Williamson was still at the door. He could hear her breathing. Aurors apparently learned to breathe quietly the way other people learn to breathe normally, and the occasional soft shift of her weight. She'd been there since the hall. Harry pulled his knees up, wrapped his arms around them, and did an inventory. He'd been doing this since he was 7. Not a spoken inventory, never spoken. Number 4 Privet Drive was not a place where speaking to yourself was received neutrally, but a silent, systematic one. What hurts, what's manageable, what's actually important right now? He'd found it useful. He still found it useful. He suspected he'd find it useful for the rest of his life, which was probably something he'd think about more later. His core was tingling. That was the primary thing. The warm vibration had settled into a steady hum, less intense than it had been right after the hat removed the first 2 suppressors, but richer somehow, like a note being played on a better instrument. His head was clear. His chest was, he checked, settled. The fire from earlier wasn't gone, it had just found its resting temperature, lower and more sustainable than the first burst. He was still angry. He expected to be angry for some time. What he wasn't was afraid, and he turned that over carefully because he expected he should be. Something enormous had happened. His life had been rearranged in the space of an hour, the story he'd had for himself, orphan, nobody, survivor of something he hadn't chosen, had been revised in ways he hadn't finished reading yet. He was alone in a hospital wing in a school he'd arrived at 4 hours ago while somewhere in the castle adults were making decisions that would reshape what the next day looked like. He should probably be afraid. He wasn't. He wasn't sure yet if that was the suppressor that had been stripping his self-preservation responses, or if this was just who he was when you cleared everything else away. He suspected it was the second. He hoped it was the second. There was a difference between not being afraid because you couldn't feel fear and not being afraid because you'd looked at the situation clearly and decided fear wasn't the most useful thing available to you. He sat with that distinction until the curtain at the end of his bed shifted and Madame Pomfrey appeared, her hair slightly less tidy than it had been and her expression carrying the specific alertness of someone who had not slept. "You're awake," she said, which was observation rather than surprise. "My blanket was floating." She looked at the blanket. Back at him. "That's consistent with what the diagnostic expects," she said. "Your core is still regulating. When a magical core has been suppressed for an extended period and suppressors are removed, the magic." She considered her words. "It doesn't behave irrationally. It just looks for exits. Things around you will move. Light sources may fluctuate. You may feel warm," Harry said. "All the time." "Yeah." She studied him the way she'd been studying him all night, with a particular quality of attention that he'd come to recognize as medical concern wearing the face of professional composure. "How warm?" He held up his hand. On his fingertips, barely visible, a soft golden light, not a glow, exactly, more like the color of afternoon sun through curtains, like something just below the surface of his skin that was trying to decide whether to surface. He watched it for a moment. Flexed his fingers. It brightened briefly and then settled back. Pomfrey made a sound that he could only classify as involuntary. "That's more than 2 suppressors worth of manifestation," she said, and she was already reaching for her diagnostic parchment. "You said there might be turbulence." "Yes, but typically not." She stopped, cast a diagnostic charm, read the result, and went still the way she'd gone still when she'd first examined him. The same quality of stillness, a professional absorbing information that exceeded the range they'd prepared for. "Mr. Potter," she said, after a moment, "what the hat identified as your natural core capacity, the capacity you would have had, unbound, do you know what figure it cited?" Harry thought back. "It mentioned I was at 9%. "Yes." She looked at the parchment. Back at him. "What it measured as your natural capacity when it assessed your unbound core was not, it was quite high. Even by adult standards." A pause. 2 suppressors removed in a single evening, at your age, and you're already manifesting spontaneous wandless light emission. Without distress or intent. She wrote something. "That's not typical." "Is anything about tonight typical?" "No," she admitted. "No, it isn't. She was replacing the parchment when boots sounded in the corridor, several pairs, moving quickly, and the hospital wing's door opened with the specific authoritative swing of people who have spent enough time in official positions that they don't knock first. Williamson was on her feet. The amber light by Harry's bed brightened 2 shades without the lamp doing anything. Amelia Bones came through the door followed by 2 of the younger Aurors and, 3 steps behind, looking like she had spent the past 3 hours running on controlled fury that she refused to let show anywhere it might be seen, Professor McGonagall. Bones stopped at the foot of Harry's bed, took in the golden light at his fingertips, and, to her eternal credit, moved directly past it with the practical efficiency of someone whose priority list was already established. Mr. Potter. I'm Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I'm sorry to wake you. I was already awake, Harry said. Good. She conjured a chair and sat in it, which struck him as a deliberate choice. Sitting put her at his level, which said something about the kind of conversation she intended this to be. One of the Aurors leaned against the wall by the window. The other posted at the door. McGonagall stood to Bones' left and watched Harry with an expression he hadn't been able to fully decode yet, something that was partly professional and partly personal and partly the face of someone sitting with a feeling that had too many components to sort quickly. I need to ask you some questions, Bones said. You're not required to answer anything you don't want to. You have the right to request a ministry-appointed advocate before saying anything that might be used in formal proceedings. But I'll be honest with you, we're at the beginning of an investigation and the more you can tell us now, the faster I can do my job. She paused. Do you want to wait for an advocate? Harry considered this the way he considered everything, quickly, systematically. Does waiting slow down what happens to Dumbledore? Bones' expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did, a brief acknowledgement. Potentially. Then no, Harry said. Ask. She asked. It was a good interview, he would understand later, when he knew more about how these things were done, that Bones was exceptionally good at this, that she had the rare talent of asking questions in an order that built answers without leading them. She asked about his life at the Dursleys. Not in an emotional way, not the way people sometimes ask those questions, with a tone that implied they wanted him to perform a kind of suffering that would satisfy them. She asked practically. What was the accommodation? What was the food? What was the physical treatment? What was his access to communication? Did anyone visit? Did he have any contact with the magical world before Hagrid arrived? Did anything notable happen when he was emotionally distressed? Could he describe those incidents? He answered all of it. He was good at being factual and he was good at being concise and he had absolutely no investment in protecting the Dursleys because they had never given him any reason to, and Bones wrote everything in a small precise notebook while the Auror by the window kept a secondary record. McGonagall did not write anything. She just listened, and her face went somewhere distant and held, and she didn't look away. About halfway through, Harry said, the hat told me one of the bindings altered my pain threshold. What does that mean? Bones stopped writing. It means the binding changed the point at which you would register physical pain as significant. As information that required action. As in, it was raised, Harry said. As in, things that should have hurt more, hurt less. Yes. Harry thought about Uncle Vernon's hands. About the cupboard floor. About the number of times he'd gone to school with bruises that he'd categorized as not serious enough to change anything about how the day was going to go. Right, he said, and moved on to the next answer. The golden light at his fingertips had been brightening gradually throughout the conversation, in the way a kettle shows heat before it boils, not dramatic, just consistent, the slow accumulation of a response that didn't have anywhere to go yet. He was keeping it contained by doing what Pomfrey had suggested and thinking about something neutral whenever he felt it rise. Castle stones. The train window. Stars through enchanted ceilings. Bones noticed. She was the kind of person who noticed things without making noticing into an event. After she'd finished the initial questions, she sat back and looked at him directly. The hat identified 29 bindings. My team has been working with it for the past 2 hours to catalog each one individually. I want to walk you through what we know, because you have a right to that information and because it may help you understand what happens next. Can you handle that right now, or would you prefer to wait until morning? Now, Harry said. Bones opened a second notebook. This one was written in someone else's hand, careful, square letters, everything numbered, and she read from it with the evenness of a medical professional delivering a diagnosis. She was not cruel about it. She was also not soft about it, and he was grateful for that, because soft would have been worse. Bindings 1 through 7, she said. Core suppressors. Each binding contains a half-power reduction of your magical core's accessible output. Placed in layers, each building on the last. The first was placed when you were 14 months old, within approximately a week of the event of October 31, 1981. She paused, not for drama, just for breath. The most recent was added 6 weeks ago. June of this year. Who placed them? Harry said. That's part of the ongoing investigation. Some magical signatures we've identified. Some require further analysis. Not an evasion, a fact. He could tell the difference. Go on, he said. Binding 8. A loyalty compulsion, keyed to a specific individual's magical signature. She looked up briefly. I want to be clear about what this is. A loyalty compulsion doesn't make you love someone. It doesn't make you feel warmth or affection. What it does is make your analytical mind dismiss certain observations about that person. When your instincts or your intelligence identify a reason to distrust or question a specific individual, the compulsion interferes with that observation. It doesn't erase it, it just makes it feel irrelevant. Like something you noticed but decided wasn't important. Harry was quiet for a moment. How long has that one been there? It was first placed when you were approximately 2 years old. She held his gaze steadily. And it has been reinforced twice since. The golden light at his fingertips jumped to his wrists. Harry looked at it, looked back at Bones, and breathed through it until it retreated. Whose signature, he said. Harry. That was McGonagall, and it was the first time she'd spoken directly to him since coming into the room, and something in her voice made him look at her instead of Bones. She looked, he found it on her face after a moment, she looked ashamed. Not of him. Of something else. Of something she was part of by proximity. We will answer that question. I promise you, we will. But the investigation has to move in the right order to hold. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away, which told him something. Okay, he said. Keep going. Bones continued. Bindings 9 through 11 were memory modifications. Not obliviates, obliviates left gaps, absences you could notice if you knew where to look. These were subtler. They were targeted confounders, placed over specific categories of experience, experiences involving the magical world before age 11, experiences involving emotional responses from adults that might have raised questions, and experiences involving the specific night of October 31, 1981. He had no clear memories of that night. He'd always attributed that to being a baby. Now he understood that he'd had those memories once, and they'd been covered. Can they be recovered? He asked. Possibly. A skilled legilimens working carefully could attempt it. But we'd need to wait until more suppressors are removed to ensure the base layer is stable enough to access safely. She turned the page. Binding 12. A pain threshold alteration, as you already identified. Placed when you were 3. 3. Someone had looked at a 3-year-old child and decided it should feel less pain. He thought about why someone might want that and arrived at the answer without difficulty and set it neatly to one side, in the category of things he would return to when he had time to be fully angry about them. 13 and 14. Growth rate interference. Your magical growth, the natural development of your core that happens as a magical child ages, has been suppressed alongside the core itself. This means your actual magical development level corresponds roughly to that of a 4-year-old child, despite your being 11. The bindings ensured that any development that tried to occur was redirected and flattened. She paused. Removal of the suppressors will not reverse this immediately. Your core will begin genuine development from wherever it currently is. Given your natural capacity, the team's projection is that you'll catch up within 6 to 18 months, but it will be faster or slower depending on how the remaining bindings are removed. What's my natural capacity? Harry said. Bones glanced at the notebook. Looked at him. Are you certain you want that figure right now? Yes. She read it. Harry blinked. Then he looked at his hands. The soft golden light was back on his fingertips, warmer than before, and the ward's ambient temperature had risen 2 degrees in the last 20 minutes, which Pomfrey had noted and not commented on. He looked at the light and thought, 9%, and thought, this is 9%, and thought about what that meant, and set it aside for later with a great deal of other things. Go on, he said. The next few bindings were, in their way, the worst. 2 empathy dampeners. These ones Bones explained carefully, watching his face. They don't eliminate empathy, she said. What they do is reduce your ability to map your own emotional state with precision. You feel things, you feel them fully, but the binding disrupts the process by which you can identify what you're feeling, name it, act on it, communicate it. The effect is, people describe it as feeling like you're watching your own emotions from a slight distance. Understanding you're having them but finding them difficult to access directly. Harry sat with that. He had spent 11 years feeling things he couldn't name. Feeling them clearly and completely, knowing they were real, and being unable to do anything with them because they wouldn't come into focus. Anger he couldn't act on because he couldn't organize it. Grief he couldn't articulate because it kept sliding away. The particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who knew they were lonely but had no language for it. 2 of them, he said. Yes. For how long? The first was placed when you were 14 months. The second was added when you were 6. He looked at the ceiling. Breathed. Looked back. Next, he said. The instinct suppressor. This was the one, Bones said carefully, that her team had the most concern about. An instinct suppressor worked on the lowest level of magical cognition, below thought, below feeling, down in the layer where magic interfaced directly with the body's survival mechanisms. It had been suppressing his self-preservation responses since he was 14 months old. In practice, this meant, situations that should have triggered flight responses hadn't. Physical danger that should have felt dangerous had felt manageable. Patterns of behavior in the people around him that should have read as threatening had instead read as normal. He had never run from the Dursleys. He had never, despite everything, truly believed that what was happening to him was something that required escape. He had adapted and minimized and categorized everything as survivable. Because it was made to feel survivable. He looked at the ceiling again. The light at his fingertips was steady now, not spiking. He had the sense that his magic had decided to go quiet and let him think, which was the first time in his life he'd ever thought of his magic as something that could make that kind of decision and found the idea obvious rather than strange. Next, he said. His voice was even. He was doing the inventory, what hurts, what's manageable, what's important. All of it important. All of it manageable. Keep going. Bones kept going. For trust inhibitors. These fired whenever his analytical mind got too close to asking the right questions about specific people. Each one was keyed to a different signature. He'd find out later, when the investigation had proceeded further, whose signatures they corresponded to. For now, Bones summarized, for people who had, at various points, decided they wanted to ensure that Harry would not examine them too closely. 3 more minor bindings, 2 related to accidental magic suppression, which had been failing steadily for years because they'd been placed on top of everything else and the weight of the whole structure was creating instability throughout. One binding that Bones paused before describing. It was the newest, placed 6 weeks ago, in June. She set down the notebook and looked at him directly. This last category, she said, I want to tell you about carefully. This binding was placed with sufficient skill and deliberateness that my team has no doubt it was done by someone with expert knowledge of core mechanics. A pause. It was placed on your scar. Harry went still. It's not a suppressor, Bones said. It's a different category entirely. The closest legal analog we have is what we call a soul anchor, though that framing is imprecise and I don't want to use it in a way that overstates what we know. She was choosing her words. There is something attached to your scar that your magic has been fighting your whole life. We don't fully understand its nature yet. The binding placed 6 weeks ago was not designed to help you fight it. It was designed to keep it stable. To keep whatever is attached therefrom, expressing itself, in ways that might be noticed. Harry felt something cold move through him. Not fear, exactly. More like the body's recognition of genuine danger, which apparently survived even instinct suppression when it was acute enough. You're saying someone kept something in my scar, he said. We're saying there's something in your scar, Bones said, that someone was keeping contained. We don't know yet whether the containment was for your benefit or for other reasons. She held his gaze. We have a specialist coming in the morning. This one will not be addressed tonight. But you have a right to know it exists. Harry nodded. He looked at his hands. The golden light was gone, replaced by something quieter, a faint warmth under his skin, like sun absorbed during the day. His magic, gone still. Listening. 29 things. He ran through them in his head, methodical, numbered. 7 core suppressors. 1 loyalty compulsion. 3 memory modifications. 1 pain threshold alteration. 2 growth suppressors. 2 empathy dampeners. 1 instinct suppressor. 4 trust inhibitors. 2 accidental magic suppressors. 3 additional minor bindings. 1 scar anchor. 29. A structure built over a decade. Added to systematically. Each piece fitting with the others. Not the work of someone who panicked. Not the work of someone careless. The work of someone who had a design and followed it, who had decided very early exactly what Harry Potter should be capable of feeling and thinking and knowing, and had engineered accordingly. How many of the signatures match? Harry asked. Bones looked at him with something that might have been respect. Currently, 17 of the 29 correspond to the same primary magical signature. Harry had already known. He'd known since the hall, since the hat had said someone with precision, since McGonagall had said the investigation has to move in the right order. He'd known since he'd looked at the man in the chair and felt his magic go calm and certain rather than uncertain. Can you tell me whose it is? He said. This time it was Bones who answered, not McGonagall. Yes, she said. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The window behind her frosted over. Just that, a sheet of ice spreading across the glass in a perfect circle from the center, geometric and sudden and absolutely involuntary, and then Harry breathed once and it melted, leaving nothing but the dark glass and the stars beyond it. Pomfrey appeared from the far end of the ward. Everyone out, she said, in the voice she used for people who were about to argue with her and weren't going to win. He needs rest. You can continue this in the morning. Bones stood without argument. She paused at the curtain edge. Mr. Potter. You've conducted yourself with considerable composure tonight. There's a lot more to be angry about than I've had time to feel yet, Harry said. I'm pacing myself. Something moved in Bones' expression, brief, genuine, almost warm. Sleep, she said. The morning will be busy. She left. The Aurors went with her. The door closed. McGonagall lingered. She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment after the others had gone, and Harry looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything because neither of them had the right words yet and they both knew it. She looked older than she had at the start of the evening. Not physically, her posture was exactly the same, spine exactly vertical, chin exactly level, but in the way that knowing things makes people older. "I didn't know," she said finally. It wasn't a defense. It was just a fact she was handing him, hers to carry, not his. "I know you didn't," Harry said. And he did. He'd known since she'd drawn her wand and stood at his left in the hall. People who are complicit don't do that. She nodded once. She looked like she had more to say and had decided not to say it tonight, which he respected. "Sleep," she said, which was the same advice Bones had given him and which he had no intention of following but appreciated anyway. She left. Harry lay in the dark for a long time. The castle breathed around him, old stone, old enchantments, old air, and somewhere below him the great hall was sealed and under Aurors' supervision and the Sorting Hat was, presumably, still sitting on its stool being an extremely thorough witness to every piece of magical evidence in the room. He thought about something the Hat had said, in the minutes before everything happened, when it was still just his thoughts and its voice and the ordinary dark under an old hat. "Someone built a cage inside you and put you in it and called it protection." He turned that over. He'd spent 11 years in that cage. He'd thought the cage was the house at Privet Drive. He'd thought the cage was the Dursleys, which had at least been external, something you could someday leave, something with a door that had always been theoretical but was at least a door. He'd never suspected the cage was inside, that the smallness he'd always felt was engineered, that his inability to trust his own instincts about people had been put there specifically so he couldn't, that the dreams he remembered sideways, the grief he couldn't hold directly, the anger that kept sliding away, all of it had been manufactured. Not his fault. Not a character flaw. Not freakishness or wrongness or the particular failure of a child nobody wanted. He'd been built. Deliberately, skillfully, by someone who needed him to be a certain size. The problem, and he was thinking about this clearly now, with the two freed suppressors humming in his chest and the warm certainty of his own magic underneath him like solid ground, the problem for the person who had built him was that the building hadn't worked. Not fully. The cage had held at 9% capacity and the boy inside it had still operated onto school roofs and turned teachers' wigs blue and opened all the windows in the house without trying. At 9%. The boy at 9% had survived 11 years and arrived at Hogwarts intact. He would like to see what happened next. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, not immediately, not fully, but he rested, which was different, and his magic rested with him, low and warm and present, and the castle breathed around them both, and outside the hospital wing windows the Scottish night moved into early morning, stars tracking their slow arc toward dawn while, in the sealed hall below, the Sorting Hat continued to give its testimony with the thoroughness of 5 centuries of carefully observed injustice finally finding its proper audience. And in his chair, somewhere below all of that, Albus Dumbledore sat very still, and for 17 signatured bindings, had no answers that were going to be enough. Chapter 3, The arrest morning came to Hogwarts the way it always did, indifferent to whatever had happened the night before, light moving through windows, stone warming incrementally, the castle's 1,000 small mechanisms of routine clicking into motion regardless of the fact that approximately half its occupants hadn't slept. Birds in the Olary. Wind off the lake. The smell of breakfast from kitchens that kept their schedule with the reliability of something that had never once needed to be told what time it was. Harry had been awake for an hour before the light changed. He'd lain still through the transition from dark to grey to pale gold, doing nothing in particular except existing in the quiet space of his own head, which felt different this morning than it had yesterday. Larger, maybe. Or just, cleaner. Like a room someone had moved furniture out of and you kept expecting to navigate around the shapes of things that weren't there anymore. He sat up and looked at his hands. No golden light, not spontaneously. But when he turned his attention inward, down past thought and feeling to the thing that the Hat had called his core, it was there. Warm. Awake. Not the thin, distant flicker he'd been living with his whole life, the magic that sometimes slipped out sideways when he was frightened or furious. Something more like a fire that was actually getting enough air. He got up, found his clothes folded on the chair beside the bed, and dressed. Pomfrey appeared before he'd finished with his shoes, already holding a tray. "Sit," she said. "I've been sitting since last night." "Then you've had practice." She set the tray on the bed with the manner of someone depositing a legal document. "Eat. All of it. Your body has been managing a malnourished magical core for a decade and it needs fuel before we discuss anything else today." Harry ate. The food was better than anything he could remember eating at Privet Drive, which wasn't a high bar, but the eggs were real and the toast was warm and there was orange juice that tasted like it had known an actual orange recently. He ate all of it and felt the difference in a way that was slightly embarrassing, the simple animal relief of a body being given what it needed. While he ate, Pomfrey cast her morning diagnostics with the efficiency of someone who developed a full routine since last night. She made small notations on her parchment and didn't share them, which he'd already learned was her processing face rather than her withholding face. There was a difference. 2 more suppressors released overnight, she said finally. Harry looked up. "I didn't feel that. Your core is doing it. Slowly, in small increments, while you sleep." She looked at him over the top of her parchment. "Your magic is motivated. Is that a medical term?" "It is now." She set the parchment down. "The team from the DMLE is coming at 8. They want to attempt to remove binding 12, the pain threshold alteration, under controlled conditions. That one is best addressed by a specialist rather than waiting for your core to manage it independently." A pause. "It will be unpleasant. Not dangerous, but unpleasant. Removing a pain threshold alteration means your pain responses will recalibrate, and the process of recalibration is felt." "How unpleasant?" "I'll have potions ready," she said, which answered his question. There was a knock at the hospital wing door. Williamson, still on door duty, opened it. The round-faced boy from last night, Longbottom, Neville, stood in the corridor in his new school robes with a toad tucked under one arm and the expression of someone who had been standing outside a door for some time working up to knocking. "I can come back," he said immediately, looking at Harry. The other Aurors said I should come talk to someone, and they sent me here, and I can come back." "Come in," Harry said. Neville came in. He stood in the middle of the ward in the uncertain way of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible, which was a posture Harry recognized in the way you recognize something you've been doing yourself. The toad, Trevor, Harry remembered vaguely from the train, made a sound of mild complaint and was repositioned. "They found bindings on me too," Neville said. "Last night, after the thing with you. The hat asked to check some of the other students, and they found, I've got 6. He said it like he was reporting the number of steps to a destination. Matter of fact. Getting through it. Not like yours. But 6. "I know," Harry said. "Or, I heard something about it." "Sit down." Neville sat on the bed beside Harry's with the immediate obedience of someone who hadn't expected to be invited. He looked at his toad for a moment. "My gran told me my magic was unstable," he said. "That's why she had them put on. She said the bindings were medical. That they were keeping my core from damaging itself." He looked up. "The Auror said that's not true. She said it wasn't my core that was unstable. She said my core was fine." His voice stayed level, which was the kind of effort that looks like calm but isn't. "She said my gran just thought I wasn't good enough." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Your gran didn't know she was wrong." "No," Neville said. "But she still did it." "Yeah," Harry said. "That's both things at once. They can both be true." Neville looked at him with something that was partly surprise and partly relief, the look of someone who'd expected to be told one of those things and not the other. He nodded slowly and turned his toad around in his hands. They sat in companionable quiet for a moment, which was the specific quiet of two people who've been handed the same kind of information and are each privately deciding what to do with it. "What's yours feel like?" Harry asked. "Your magic, now." Neville thought about it honestly. "Less like I'm trying to push through something," he said finally. "Like, before, every time I tried to do magic it felt like trying to open a stuck door. You know it should open, you know you're doing it right, but there's this resistance." He looked at his free hand. "This morning in the common room I summoned my parchment from across the room without thinking about it. Just reached for it and thought I needed it and it came." He said this last part very quietly, like someone describing a miracle they weren't sure they were allowed to have. "I've never done that before." "Good," Harry said, and meant it cleanly. At 8 o'clock exactly, the DMLE team arrived, and with them came a witch Harry hadn't seen before, small, with sharp eyes behind wire spectacles and ink stains on 3 fingers of her right hand that weren't recent. She introduced herself as Healer Vance, specializing in core mechanics, and she had the efficient warmth of someone who'd spent a career putting people back together and was good at it. She removed Binding 12, the pain threshold alteration, in 32 minutes, and Pomfrey had been right about the unpleasantness. Harry gripped the side of the bed and breathed through it while his nervous system recalibrated through what felt like 11 years of deferred sensation arriving with interest. It wasn't excruciating. It was thorough. When it was done he sat back against the pillow and felt the strange new sharpness of the world, the grain of the sheet under his fingers, the weight of his own feet, the particular cool of the castle air on his arms, and understood that this was just the baseline, this was just normal, and he'd been living significantly below it. "All right?" Healer Vance asked. "Yes," Harry said, and this time it was actually true. By 9 in the morning there were more Aurors in the castle than Harry had been told to expect. He found this out when McGonagall came to collect him from the hospital wing. She'd been granted supervised access, which told him that Bones had made a determination about her status in the investigation, and walked with him through corridors that had a different quality to their usual morning movement. Not chaos. Controlled activity. Ministry personnel moving between floors with the purposeful economy of a machine that had been switched on and was processing. "What's happening?" Harry asked. "The DMLE spent the night working through the halts testimony," McGonagall said. Her voice was doing the thing again, precise, all emotion tucked below the surface. "The evidentiary case was complete by 4 in the morning. Bones filed the charges at 6. She paused. "The Wisengamot has already confirmed jurisdiction." Harry absorbed this. "When are they arresting him?" "This morning." She glanced at him, then looked forward again. "You don't have to be present." "I'm not avoiding it," Harry said. She was quiet for a moment. "I know." They were headed, it turned out, to the entrance hall, which was where Bones had chosen to make the arrest. Not the Great Hall. Harry thought about that choice later and understood it. The Great Hall was where the students were. The entrance hall was a public space without being a theater. A deliberate middle ground between private and spectacle. But word had gotten out the way word always gets out in a place where hundreds of teenagers live, and by the time Harry and McGonagall reached the top of the stairs, the mezzanine that overlooked the entrance hall from the first floor was lined with students, silent and pressed against the railing with the stillness of people watching something they understood was important. Gryffindors, mostly, and Ravenclaws, and some Hufflepuffs, and at the far end a cluster of Slytherins who were watching with expressions ranging from calculated neutrality to something that might have been unease. Harry saw Hermione Granger in the front row of the mezzanine, holding a book she had stopped reading some time ago. She spotted him and her eyes went to his face with the specific searching attention of someone trying to determine from a distance how a person was. He gave her a small nod. She gave one back, and then turned to watch the hall below. He did too. Dumbledore was standing near the foot of the main staircase. He was dressed, robes exact, beard arranged, every inch of him radiating the particular composure of someone who had decided that composure was his best remaining asset. He wasn't restrained. 2 Aurors stood behind him, not touching him, but there. Bones stood 3 feet away, notebook open, her monocle catching the morning light through the entrance doors. Beside Dumbledore stood Minerva McGonagall, which Harry found confusing for a moment before he realized she'd appeared beside him on the stairs rather than continuing down, and that the McGonagall-shaped figure beside Dumbledore was a junior Auror who had apparently been assigned to maintain proximity. He looked at McGonagall beside him. She was watching Dumbledore with her hands clasped behind her back. Professor Snape stood near the wall. Harry noticed him in the way you notice something cold in a room, peripherally, with the body before the mind. He was very still. He was watching the scene with his arms folded and his face in the configuration that Harry was already learning meant he was doing serious thinking he didn't want anyone to see. A handful of other professors. Sprout, looking unhappy. Flitwick, looking shocked in the way of someone who was having trouble revising a long-held model. Quirrell, who was standing slightly apart from the others near the door to the corridor and who Harry, looking at him, found his gaze sliding away from for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. He filed that away. Bones spoke. She had a carrying voice that didn't need to perform itself. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. By the authority of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and the jurisdiction confirmed this morning by the Wisingamat of Great Britain, you are placed under formal arrest on the following charges. She didn't use notes. She'd committed them to memory, which was another choice. 17 counts of illegal magical binding of a minor, in violation of Sections 4, 7, and 19 of the Magical Beings Protection Act of 1847, as amended. 1 count of illegal placement of a loyalty compulsion on a minor, in violation of the Compulsion Prohibition Act of 1951. 3 counts of illegal memory modification of a minor without parental consent or Wisingamat authorization, in violation of the Memory Modification Regulation Act of 1899. 1 count of illegal magical interference with natural growth and development of a minor's core. 1 count of illegal pain threshold alteration on a minor. She paused. And 1 count of placement of an unregistered soul-adjacent anchor on a living magical being without consent. Another pause. These charges correspond to a minimum sentencing guideline of 30 years in Azkaban per count, with the possibility of life imprisonment given the duration and systematic nature of the offenses. The entrance hall was absolutely silent. Dumbledore stood through all of it without moving. When Bones finished, he turned his head slightly, as if he were about to speak, and she said, "You are not required to say anything at this time. Anything you say may be entered as part of the formal record." A beat. "I'd recommend quiet." He looked at her. Then, for the first time, his gaze moved past her, up, to the mezzanine above. To Harry. Harry looked back at him. He didn't look away, which he noted as a new thing, the absence of the urge to look away that he'd always had in the presence of authority he was supposed to defer to. The loyalty compulsion had been found and named last night. He could feel its absence now like a tooth that had been pulled, the space where it used to push him and didn't anymore. Dumbledore's expression, meeting his, was genuinely difficult to read. It wasn't guilt, or not only guilt, or not guilt in the way Harry expected guilt to look. It was more like the face of a man looking at an equation he'd spent a decade solving and finding that the answer had come out different from what he'd intended, and not knowing yet whether that made the equation wrong or the intention. Harry looked at him with the clear, settled fire that had been burning since last night. Then he looked away first, because he chose to, which was entirely different from being made to. The Aurors moved. An anti-apparition jinx, a portkey restriction, and then the simple physical fact of 2 people flanking you closely enough to communicate that you were no longer choosing your own direction. Dumbledore walked with them without resistance, and his posture remained exact, and his beard remained arranged, and he went out through the entrance doors into the Scottish morning. The doors swung shut. The silence held for 3 more seconds. Then it broke entirely. The mezzanine erupted, not into chaos, but into the sustained, overlapping noise of 300 people all having the same conversation at different volumes. Harry stood at the top of the main staircase and watched the entrance doors and let the noise happen around him. McGonagall was beside him, not speaking, standing with the particular stillness of someone who has just watched something they've been afraid to look at directly and is still processing what they saw. "Professor," Harry said, without looking at her. "Yes. What happens to Hogwarts now?" She was quiet for a moment. "Deputy headmistress becomes acting headmistress," she said. "Until the governors appoint." A pause, and something briefly human moved through her professional composure. "So I suppose I do." "Good," Harry said. She looked at him sharply, not offended, more surprised. "He's been sitting at the top of that table for 30 years, Harry said, "and not one person in the building checked." He met her eyes. "You would have checked." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who didn't know whether to be moved or unsettled and had settled somewhere between both. "Yes," she said. "I would have." She straightened slightly, which was impressive given that she'd been standing straight already. "You should eat a proper breakfast. There are 400 students in that hall who are going to need their teachers to appear competent today, and I have a very long morning ahead of me." "Can I go back to the sorting ceremony?" Harry asked. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I wasn't sorted last night," Harry said. "I don't have a house. There are a few of us, Longbottom and I at least," because his was interrupted too. He paused. "I want to finish." McGonagall looked at him with something she didn't name, then nodded once. "Tonight," she said. "After dinner. We'll finish the sorting." She went down the stairs toward the entrance hall, and Harry went in the direction of the Great Hall because she was right about breakfast, and the morning shifted into motion around him with the particular momentum of a situation that was nowhere near finished. He was halfway to the hall when someone fell into step beside him. "You're not scared," said the voice. He looked over. Hermione Granger, book now under her arm, a slight flush in her cheeks that suggested she'd moved quickly to catch him. She was looking at him with the directness of someone for whom observation was a primary language. "No," he said. "You should be," she said, and it wasn't unkind, it was analytical. "You've just watched the most powerful wizard in Britain arrested at your 11-year-old testimony, you've had illegal modifications removed from your core that are going to change everything about how your magic works, and you have," she appeared to be mentally cataloguing, "a scar with something in it that even the Aurors don't fully understand yet. Most people in your position would be terrified. Most people in my position haven't had their fear responses suppressed since they were 14 months old," Harry said. She stopped walking. He stopped too. She worked through it visibly. "That's not what I meant, though. I don't think that's why you're not scared." She was watching him with the focused attention of someone assembling a conclusion in real time. "You're not scared because you've looked at the whole thing and decided that fear isn't what it needs from you." He looked at her. "Yes." She started walking again, and this time it was she who'd decided rather than she who'd been following. "I want to understand the bindings," she said. "The legal framework. I've already started reading. I found 3 texts in the library last night before they locked the section. The Magical Beings Protection Act is extraordinary in its scope, but the enforcement mechanism it relies almost entirely on the hat's testimony, doesn't it? Because the hat's enchantments make it the only class of object whose testimony the Wizengamot has to accept without corroboration." She glanced at him. "It's the oldest standing enchantment in the castle. Older than the school itself. Gryffindor wove a truth clause into its core enchantment in 1003 CE. That's why Dumbledore couldn't interfere. The hat's testimony is literally unimpeachable by Wizengamot precedent." "You got all of that from last night?" Harry said. "I got all of that before midnight," she said. "I've done more since." She said it without apology. "The question is what happens at the Wizengamot hearing. His supporters will argue, they're already arguing, I've seen the early morning prophet, that the bindings were placed with protective intent, which isn't a legal defense but will be made into a sympathetic one. The public narrative is going to fracture." She looked at him. "You need to be prepared for a lot of people to tell you he did it for your own good." "I know," Harry said. And you're not worried about that? He considered it genuinely. I'm worried about the evidence holding, he said. I'm not worried about what people think of me for bringing it. He pushed open the door to the Great Hall. People were already thinking things about me before I opened my eyes this morning. That's not new. She walked in beside him with the expression of someone updating a file they'd been keeping. The Great Hall was loud in the specific way of a room processing a shared event, conversations layered over each other, voices rising and dropping, the quality of noise that contained mostly the words Dumbledore and arrested and but why and did you see and Harry Potter. Heads turned when he came in. He walked to the Gryffindor table. Technically he still didn't have a house, but it was where Hermione sat and where Neville was already seated over a bowl of porridge looking like someone enduring the morning through sheer willpower, and sat down without ceremony. Ron Weasley materialized from somewhere down the table almost immediately. Harry had spoken to him on the train, briefly, and remembered him as someone who said exactly what he was thinking without much filtering, which Harry had found refreshing at the time and found refreshing again now. You're actually here, Ron said. I heard they might send you to St. Mungo's. Madame Pomfrey's better than St. Mungo's, Harry said, which he didn't actually know but suspected. Fred says Dumbledore went quietly, Ron reported, with the information forwarding energy of the middle child of a large family who has learned that being the one with news is social currency. George says he searched for the word his brothers had used. Calculating. Like he was already working on something. He probably is, Harry said. Ron processed this. Doesn't that bother you? It would bother me more if he looked defeated, Harry said. A man who looks defeated stops working. A man who looks like he's calculating is still out in the open where I can see him. Ron stared at him for a second with the expression of someone receiving information delivered faster than expected. Then he reached for the toast. Right, he said, and handed Harry a piece without being asked, which Harry appreciated for its simplicity. Down the table, the twins were watching Harry with matching expressions of assessment that were slightly different from the rest of the hall's gawking. Not hero worship, not alarm. More like two people who had found a thing they hadn't expected to find interesting and were deciding what to do about that. We owe you an apology, one of them said. Fred, Harry thought, the one who sat left. Last night, during the sorting. We were taking bets on which house you'd end up in. Seemed like a lark. A pause. Didn't know what was actually happening. Yeah, said the other, George. Sorry about that. How much did you lose? Harry asked. A surprised beat. 12 sickles, said Fred. What did you bet? Gryffindor, said George. Obviously. You might still win, Harry said. Tonight. McGonagall's finishing the sorting. Both twins turned to look at each other in the specific wordless way of people who have spent their entire lives translating themselves to each other. Then they both looked at Harry with something that had crystallized into something specific and decided. Right, said Fred. We're friends now. Is that how that works? Harry said. With us, yes, said George. Harry ate his toast and thought that this was probably fine. 3 tables away, at the Slytherin bench, Draco Malfoy had been watching. Harry was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, not looking at it, just knowing it's there. Malfoy had an expression on his face that was complicated in the way of someone whose entire inherited framework for understanding the world was being revised in real time, and who was not entirely sure yet what the revision meant for him personally. After a moment, Malfoy looked away and said something to Crabbe. Whatever it was, neither Crabbe nor Goyle looked satisfied by it, which meant it probably wasn't triumphant. Harry filed it away. Snape was at the high table. He was eating nothing, drinking tea, and looking at a point somewhere between his cup and the middle distance. He had looked like this since the entrance hall. Harry ate his eggs and watched him, not obviously, the way the hat had apparently watched everything for 500 years, present and noting and deciding nothing yet. The sorting hat was gone from its stool. Someone had moved it, presumably back to the headmaster's office, which was now the deputy headmistress's office, which made things complicated. Harry made a mental note to talk to the hat when he could. He had questions. Specifically, the 12 signatures of the bindings that hadn't been Dumbledore's. Bones had said 17 out of 29 were his. The remaining 12 had other signatures. Some of them she'd recognized and hadn't named. Some required more analysis. 12. He thought about the binding placed 6 weeks ago, in June. 6 weeks before Hogwarts. Someone had known he was coming, known the hat would find it, and placed a new anchor, not to protect him, the hat had said, but to keep whatever was there stable. To prevent it from expressing itself in ways that might be noticed. Before he could go further with that thought, there was a disturbance at the Slytherin table. Not physical, more like a shift in the quality of attention, the way a single person changing their posture can change the feeling in a room if the person is the right one. Malfoy had stood up. He was looking across the hall. Not at Harry. At the high table. "Professor Snape," he said. His voice was controlled in the deliberate way of someone who has been taught that control is power, not the natural way of someone who doesn't have to work at it. Was it true? What the Aurors said this morning? That you knew about some of the bindings? The hall went quiet again. It had been doing that, the rapid toggling between noise and absolute silence, all morning, collective breath held then released then held again as the information kept arriving. Snape put down his teacup. He looked at Malfoy with the specific regard of a professor encountering a student who has asked a question in public that they'd both rather were private, and the calculation of whether to answer or deflect was visible for a moment in his eyes, unusual for Snape, who was generally better at hiding his calculations than almost anyone. "That is a matter currently under investigation," Snape said. "And not appropriate for breakfast." "That's a yes," said Fred Weasley, from the Gryffindor table, in the cheerful tone of someone stating a fact. Snape's gaze moved to Fred with the cold precision of a practiced legilimens assessing a threat. Fred held it without flinching, which was its own kind of remarkable. Then Snape's eyes moved on, swept the hall, and landed briefly on Harry. It was a difficult look to categorize. Not menace. Not apology. Something more complex than either, the look of a man sitting with a thing he'd done that couldn't be undone and hadn't yet decided what to do with the weight of it. Harry met his gaze with the same clear steadiness he'd given Dumbledore. Not aggressive. Not forgiving. Just present. "I see you. I haven't decided yet." Snape looked away first. Breakfast continued. At 11 that morning, Bones found Harry in the corridor outside the library, which was where he'd gone after breakfast to think rather than read, which Hermione, when she'd found him there an hour earlier, had found personally offensive and had responded to by pressing 3 books into his hands and leaving. He'd read 2 of them because they were genuinely interesting and because reading had always been easy in a way that most things hadn't been. Bones sat across from him with the directness of someone whose time was her own resource and she managed it accordingly. "The investigation is moving quickly," she said. "Faster than I expected. Part of that is the hat, its testimony has evidentiary weight that our normal case building doesn't get to start with, and it saved us significant groundwork." She paused. "The Wisengamot has set a preliminary hearing date. 3 weeks. Harry looked up from the book. 3 weeks isn't long. No. It isn't. She watched him. The speed is partly political. Several Wisengamot members want this resolved before public opinion has time to fully consolidate around Dumbledore's defense narrative. If this drags on, his supporters, and there are many, will have time to construct an argument that neutralizes the evidence. A beat. There's also the matter of who holds Hogwarts in the interim. The governors met this morning. McGonagall is confirmed as acting headmistress. Good, Harry said again. Bones gave him the same sharp look McGonagall had. You say that like you already know her character. She stood at my left when the hat spoke, Harry said. She drew her wand. She didn't ask permission. He closed the book. That tells me enough. Bones looked at him with something that was moving through several expressions in quick succession and landing on what appeared to be professional respect operating at higher temperatures than usual. "The 12 signatures we haven't attributed yet," she said, cutting straight to it in a way that told him she'd noticed his mind would already be there. "We've identified 4 more since last night. I can tell you one of them because it's relevant to your immediate situation and because you have a legal right to know." "Snape," Harry said. Bones didn't look surprised that he'd said it. 2 bindings. Both in the category of memory modification. Not deep ones, surface modifications, affecting your perception of specific recent events. A pause. "He placed them on your last visit to Diagon Alley. 6 weeks ago. The same trip on which the scar anchor was reinforced." Harry thought about Diagon Alley. Hagrid, the enormous man who delivered his Hogwarts letter, taking him through a pub and into a different world. Gringotts. The wand shop. Robes. The whole cascading joy of it, and then, a gap. There was a gap, now that he looked for it. About 40 minutes somewhere between Gringotts and Ollivanders, which he'd always attributed to being overwhelmed and not remembering clearly. He'd been overwhelmed, it was true. But the gap was the wrong shape for simple overwhelm. "What do they cover?" Harry said. "We believe he saw something in the course of the Diagon Alley visit that Dumbledore asked him to modify." She paused. "We don't know what. Recovering it is a delicate process and will need to move carefully. We'd want your permission and cooperation." "You have it," Harry said immediately. "I also," Bones said, "want to revisit the matter of the scar." Harry sat up slightly. "The specialist I mentioned last night, Healer Croker, from the Department of Mysteries, is arriving this afternoon. He's the foremost expert in Britain on soul-adjacent magical phenomena." She was watching him carefully. "I want to be clear with you, Harry, because you've handled this better than any adult I've watched receive half this information. What's in your scar, what the binding was containing, we believe it's a fragment of Voldemort's soul." The library corridor was very quiet. "A fragment," Harry said. "Yes. We believe, based on the magical signature analysis and Healer Croker's preliminary assessment from the notes we sent him last night, that when Voldemort's killing curse rebounded on October 31, 1981, the violence of the rebound tore a piece of his soul loose and it attached to the only living thing in the room." "Me," Harry said. "You." A pause. "The binding Dumbledore placed was not, as far as we can determine, designed to remove it. It was designed to keep it dormant. Stable. It was designed to keep you alive, because if you died, the fragment would need a new host, and an unhoused soul fragment is dangerous and unpredictable." Her voice stayed level. "But there's another interpretation." "He needed me alive," Harry said. "For whatever came next." Bones was quiet. "He told the Dursleys I was ordinary," Harry said, thinking aloud. "He kept me small. He bound my magic so I'd never be powerful enough to be a threat or a variable he couldn't control. He kept me ignorant of the magical world. He kept me," he stopped. "He kept me exactly the size he needed me to be." "Yes. For what?" Bones put her notebook on the table. Opened it to a specific page. Set it in front of him. He read the page. He read it twice. He sat back and looked at the stone ceiling of the corridor, which was very old and utterly unmoved by revelations. A prophecy. A boy born at the end of July to parents who had thrice defied Voldemort. The power the Dark Lord knows not. Neither can live while the other survives. He was going to use me as a weapon, Harry said. He was going to use you as a, Bones searched for better words. He framed your life as a sacrifice. He planned, at the appropriate moment, for you to die and take the soul fragment with you. The bindings kept you small enough, obedient enough, unself-possessed enough that he believed you would accept that role without knowing you were choosing it. Harry looked at the prophecy. The prophecy looked back, which was not literally true but felt true in the way of things that have been aimed at you from birth. Does the fragment have to kill me to be destroyed? He said. Croaker believes there may be alternatives, Bones said carefully. That's partly why he's coming. Right. Harry closed the notebook and slid it back to her. He picked up his book. His hands were perfectly steady. Thank you for telling me directly. You're 11 years old, Bones said, and it was not a patronizing statement, it was an acknowledgement. And the most self-possessed person I've spoken to this week, and I've spoken to a lot of people this week. I've had practice, Harry said. Being the smallest person in the room and needing to be clear-headed about it. I've had 11 years of practice. She gathered her things. At the corridor's end she paused. Healer Croaker at 4. Hospital wing. A beat. And, Harry, we're going to find out whose signatures those remaining 8 bindings are. I want you to be prepared for the list to include people you've come to trust in the last 24 hours. Harry thought about that. How many people did he need to do all this, he said. More than one person's worth of knowledge and access, Bones said. At a minimum, 2 or 3 specialists across different fields, plus whoever handled the Desley arrangements. She paused. He had a long time to build a network. She left. Harry opened his book. Stared at the page without reading it for approximately 30 seconds. Then he read it, because it was interesting, because his mind needed something to do with itself besides circle, and because whatever was coming at 4 o'clock and at the Wisingamot hearing in 3 weeks and in all the various places that were going to need him to be clear-headed, for all of that, he needed to keep thinking. Keep eating. Keep taking inventory. What hurts? What's manageable? What's important right now? All of it. All of it. All of it. And that evening, after dinner, with the hall quieter than it had been and everyone just slightly off balance from a day that had contained too many revelations to fully process, he walked back to the stool in the great hall and sat down, and the hat was placed on his head, and the hat said nothing aloud, just the voice in the dark, hello again. Hello, Harry thought. You've had a day. Yes. The hat sat with him for a moment, and there was something different about this silence than the last one, something that had been holding its breath had exhaled. The hat had done its job. The machine it had set in motion was in motion. Now it was just this, an old hat, an 11-year-old boy, the ordinary business of deciding where he belonged. You know, said the hat, there hasn't been anyone like you at this school since its 2nd generation of students. What house were they in? All 4, said the hat. Which is precisely the problem. Harry felt something warm and inevitable settling over him, like the moment you recognize a song you didn't know you remembered. You could put me anywhere, Harry thought. Couldn't you? Yes. A pause. But you asked where you belong, not where you'd be useful. Is there a difference? With you, perhaps not, said the hat. But the intent matters. The fire in Harry's chest. The steady warmth of his core, for suppressors lighter than it had been yesterday. The clarity. The anger that wasn't loud anymore, just solid and sustaining, like coal rather than kindling. I want to belong somewhere I chose. Yes, said the hat, and there was something like satisfaction in its ancient voice, and then it lifted its voice to the hall, Gryffindor. The table erupted. Not just politely. Fully, genuinely, with the specific energy of people who had been through something together and needed somewhere to put it. The twins were on their feet. Neville, already in Gryffindor, placed there quietly while Harry had been in the hospital wing, was clapping with his whole self. Ron was grinning. Hermione, already at the table, looked like she was trying to look unsurprised and wasn't quite managing it. Harry walked to the table and sat down, and the noise was warm around him, and for the first time in his life the place he was sitting felt like something he'd gotten to because of who he actually was, not what had been shaped around him. That, he thought, was a start. Chapter 4, What was taken the first time Harry used magic without a wand. It was Tuesday morning, and it was an accident, and it destroyed 3/4 of a target dummy in a way that made Flitwick go very quiet for almost a full minute. It had started ordinarily enough. McGonagall had decided, with the specific, controlled pragmatism of a woman managing a school in crisis while simultaneously managing the fallout from said crisis, that the first years needed to begin their curriculum regardless of what was happening at the ministry level. Normal routine was stabilizing. She'd said this to the staff in a tone that did not invite debate, and the staff had not debated it, and Monday morning had proceeded with the specific determined normalcy of people choosing competence over chaos. Harry had attended every class. He took notes in the clean, slightly cramped handwriting of someone self-taught, sat in the middle of rows where possible, and watched everything. He was very good at watching things. He'd been good at it his whole life because watching had been safer than participating, but now the watching had a different quality. He wasn't cataloging escape routes anymore. He was just interested. Charms was third period Tuesday. Flitwick had them attempting Wingardium Leviosa, which Harry had read about on the train and Hermione had apparently already practiced, if the way she'd been flexing her wand hand all through breakfast was any indication. The classroom had the benign, chalk-dusty atmosphere of a space where nothing dangerous was supposed to happen, which made it a good place for accidents. The problem was the suppressor removal. Healer Vance had taken 3 more out Sunday, under supervision. That brought the total removed to 7, still 22 remaining, which was the majority of them, but 7 was not nothing. 7 was enough that Harry's magic had been spending the past 48 hours doing what Pomfrey had described as recalibrating, which in practice meant it was looking for things to express itself through and occasionally finding them before he did. Flitwick was demonstrating the wand movement, swish and flick, very precise, and the feather on his desk rose obediently to head height and waited there like a well-trained dog. "Now you try," he said. "Remember, it's not force that lifts it. It's intention directing force. The wand is a focus, not a club." Harry picked up his wand, which was still adjusting to him in the subtle way wands apparently did. Ollivander had said something about wands learning their wizards, which Harry found both interesting and slightly alarming, and looked at the feather. He thought, up. The feather went up. So did the desk. So did approximately 6 textbooks from the surrounding area, one of Seamus Finnegan's shoes, and the target dummy that Professor Flitwick had set up in the corner for the later lesson, which flew into the wall at sufficient velocity to separate its upper half from its lower half with a flat, definitive thud. The class went completely silent. Harry lowered his wand slowly. The desk came down. The books came down. The shoe came down. The target dummy stayed in its 2 pieces. Flitwick had gone up on his stack of books, which meant he was exactly at eye level with Harry, which he was apparently doing on purpose to communicate that this was a direct conversation rather than a corrective one. His expression was the careful neutrality of a professional reconfiguring their expectations. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Did you intend any of that?" "Only the feather," Harry said. Flitwick looked at the feather, which was hovering serenely at exactly the height he'd demonstrated, not a millimeter off. He looked at the dismembered dummy. He looked back at Harry. "Yes," he said. "Right." He made a note on his parchment that Harry could see involved several underlines. The intention was correct. The output was broader than directed. "We'll work on focus." He climbed down from his books and said, in the manner of someone pivoting expertly, "Everyone else please attempt the feather. Mr. Potter, try again but imagine the magic as a thread rather than a push." Harry tried it as a thread. The feather rose with perfect precision and stayed exactly where he told it to, and nothing else in the room moved. "Good," said Flitwick. He didn't say anything about the dummy. He did, later that week, very quietly ask McGonagall to source replacement equipment, and he did note in Harry's file that his magical output required individualized monitoring, and he did not, at any point, make it into something Harry needed to apologize for. Harry decided he liked Flitwick. After Charms, he had a free period, which he spent in the library with Hermione. This had become a pattern in the 3 days since the sorting. She had books, he had questions, and between the two of them there was a productive division of labor that neither of them had formally proposed but both had simply adopted. She found things. He thought about the things she found. She thought about what he thought and usually had a counterpoint. They argued efficiently and without resentment, which was rarer than either of them was old enough to know. She had found something this morning that she was holding slightly away from her, as if she was not entirely certain she should have it, which told him it was important before she'd said a word. "I found a reference," she said. "To the founder's original enchantment on the hat. Not the general history, specifically the legal clause. The one that makes the hat's testimony binding on the Wizengamot." He sat down. "And?" "The clause was written by Salazar Slytherin." She set the book on the table between them. "Not Gryffindor." "Gryffindor wove the truth mechanism into the hat's core, yes, but the legal weight, the specific provision that the Wizengamot must accept the hat's testimony as evidence, that was Slytherin's addition." Harry looked at the text. "Why?" "Because Slytherin didn't trust people in power to make decisions about children without oversight he couldn't control personally." She tapped the passage. "He wanted a mechanism that couldn't be bought, couldn't be argued away, couldn't be influenced by whoever was currently running the ministry or the school. He built the legal clause because he knew that powerful people would eventually do what powerful people do, and he wanted something in place that they couldn't touch." Harry sat with that for a moment. "Slytherin built the protection for students." "It's more complicated than that," Hermione said, with the precision of someone who had read far enough not to simplify. "His motivations were, he was Slytherin, his interest was in preserving the quality and bloodlines of magical students, which is reprehensible in its own context. But the mechanism he built was broader than his intentions for it." She looked at him. "The hat used a Slytherin-authored protection to expose what Dumbledore did to you." Harry thought about that. The hat had said the founders were complicated. He was beginning to understand that in a more concrete way than the saying usually permitted. "The hat told me there hadn't been anyone like me here since the second generation," he said. "It sorted me into Gryffindor but said it could have put me anywhere." Hermione was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of someone who has a thought they're not sure how to say. "You know," she said finally, "there are theories about what really happened in 1981. About why the killing curse rebounded. The standard explanation is your mother's sacrifice, love as a magical protection. Which is true, as far as it goes. What's the version that goes further?" She turned to a different page. "Some theorists believe the rebound wasn't just a function of love as an abstract concept. That love as a magical force can only fully manifest in a core that is, genuinely itself. Unconstricted. And that the specific signature of Lily Potter's sacrifice was so perfectly matched to your core that it didn't just protect you passively. It activated something." She looked up. "Something that's been bound ever since." Harry was still. "The soul fragment in your scar," he said slowly. "If it's been binding to a suppressed core, then removing the suppressors isn't just releasing your power," Hermione said. "It might also be making the fragment unstable. Because what it's been attached to is changing." She closed the book. "I think that's why Dumbledore placed the anchor 6 weeks ago. I think he knew you were coming to Hogwarts. I think he knew what happens when a 14-year suppressed core starts interacting with Hogwarts' ambient magic. It would begin to wake up on its own." She paused. "And he put something in place to make sure it didn't before he was ready." "Before I was in position," Harry said. "Yes." They were both quiet for a moment. "I have a meeting with Healer Croker this afternoon," Harry said. "Second one. He's been running tests." "I know. I've been reading everything I can find on soul magic." She looked at him, direct. "I should come." Harry looked at her. 3 days ago she'd been the girl who explained things in the checking up voice on the way into the hall. Now she was the person sitting across from him who'd spent 72 hours reading every text that was relevant to his survival and had found things his Auror team hadn't found yet. "Yes," he said. "You should." Croker was a thin man in his 60s who wore unspeakable gray and had the manner of someone whose professional relationship with the unknown had made him very calm about it. He received Hermione's presence at the afternoon meeting with a single raised eyebrow that then lowered without comment, which Harry took as acceptance. "You've been reading," Croker said to Hermione, after she'd asked her second question. "Yes," she said. "What have you found?" She told him about the core activation theory. About the rebound signature. About the suppressor interaction with the soul fragment stability. She laid it out with the clarity of someone who'd organized their reading into a coherent argument, and Croker listened without interrupting, and when she finished he looked at her the way Flitwick had looked at Harry's feather, the specific stillness of a professional encountering something better than expected. "The core activation theory is not mainstream," he said. "But it's not wrong." He turned to Harry. "The preliminary scan I ran Sunday showed that the fragment is responding to the suppressor removal. As your core expands, the fragment's anchor is becoming thinner. It was designed to bind to a suppressed core. It doesn't have the same grip on a core that's recovering." "Can it come out?" Harry said. "Possibly. The method is unprecedented. There's no established procedure for extracting a soul fragment from a living host." He paused. "What we know about Horcruxes, because that's what this is, effectively, an unintentional Horcrux, is that destruction of the fragment typically requires a force that destroys the container as well. Basilisk venom. Fiend fire." He met Harry's gaze. "Neither of which is applicable here." "There's a third method," Hermione said. Croker looked at her. "If the container isn't destroyed but the fragment loses its anchor completely, it should be possible to." She was working through it as she spoke, which Harry had come to recognize as her thinking voice, different from her explaining voice. "A fragment can only maintain coherence in a host if the host's core has some compatibility with it. Voldemort's core and Harry's core are, or were, aligned in a certain way, because the original curse was designed to destroy a specific magical signature and instead fused with it. But if Harry's core changes sufficiently, if it expands far enough beyond where it was when the fragment attached, the compatibility might break. The fragment would lose its anchor," Croker said slowly. "And if it's already weakened from the suppressor removal, it might not be able to reattach." She looked at Harry. "You'd need to remove enough suppressors quickly enough that the fragment can't adapt." "That's," Croker was quiet for a moment. "Theoretically sound. The risk is the process of removal. If the fragment destabilizes before it detaches, it will react. And a fragment of Voldemort's soul reacting inside your scar will cause symptoms." "What kind?" Harry said. "Pain. Visions. Possibly temporary access to his current mental state. If he has a mental state, his current form is unclear." He paused. "And if he becomes aware of the process, he may try to prevent it." "Through Quirrell," Harry said. Croker went very still. Harry looked at him. "I've been watching Quirrell since the first morning. He stands differently from everyone else. His eyes track the room in a specific way, he's checking for threats, not looking around. And when I look at him, my scar pulls. Just slightly, just a warmth. Like a compass finding north." He paused. "He has someone with him. In the back of his turban, or very close to it. Someone who's aware of what's happening to me and has been since the first day." Croker and Hermione were both looking at him. Croker's expression had moved through several things and landed on something serious. "How long have you known?" Croker said. "Since breakfast Monday," Harry said. "I wanted to understand it before I said anything." "You didn't mention this to Bones." "I'm mentioning it now," Harry said. "Vayu. She should know. But I want to understand it first because if she moves on Quirrell immediately, whoever's with him runs, and then we have the same problem somewhere we can't see it." He paused. "Right now I know exactly where he is." Croker studied him for a long moment. "You're 11 years old," he said, which seemed to be something adults felt the need to state at regular intervals. "People keep reminding me," Harry said. "I mean it as," Croaker paused. "Your core, Mr. Potter. At 9% capacity, you walked into this school and within 24 hours identified a hidden threat that has been evading the Ministry for a decade. What you're doing right now, the observation and the strategic patience, that's not just intelligence. That's your magic working. Your core processes information as part of its function. You've been doing it at 9% your whole life." He looked at him steadily. "I genuinely cannot predict what it will look like when you're at full capacity." Harry thought about Flitwick's dummy. "Messier," he said. "Almost certainly," said Croaker, and for the first time smiled. That evening, McGonagall summoned him to her office, Dumbledore's office, now hers, with the silver instruments still on their spindles and the portraits of previous headmasters all watching with varying degrees of discomfort, some of them pretending to be asleep with insufficient commitment. The hat was back on its shelf above the door, and Harry looked up at it when he came in. "Hello," he said to it. "Mr. Potter," said the hat, from its shelf. McGonagall was standing at the desk with 2 letters in her hand. "2 things," she said, cutting directly to it. "First, the Daily Prophet ran a piece this morning about the arrest. I saw it." He'd seen it, read it, and set it aside. The headline had been, "Dumbledore arrested, child's claims or ministry overreach?" The word claims had been doing a lot of work in that headline. "I want you to know that I have written a formal response on behalf of the school," McGonagall said, outlining the evidentiary basis of the hat's testimony and the legal framework of the arrest. "It will run tomorrow." She paused. "I also want you to know that the letters I've been receiving today include a significant volume of support." She set the letters down. "Families who know what it means to have a child's magic bound. People who've had dealings with Dumbledore's methods over the years. People who have been watching and waiting for a moment like this." She met his eyes. "You are not alone in this, Harry. I want you to understand that." He looked at the letters. There were more than 2, she'd placed them in a neat pile on the corner of the desk, and the pile was substantial. "Second thing," she said. "Snape has requested a meeting with you." Harry was quiet for a moment. "He came to me this morning," McGonagall said, carefully, "and stated that he has information relevant to the investigation that he wishes to disclose directly to you before giving it formally to Bones." A pause. "He was under no obligation to come to me first. He did so because, and I am quoting, he understands there is a right order to some things." Her expression was doing something complex. "The choice is yours entirely." Harry looked at the hat. The hat said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Tomorrow morning," Harry said. "Before breakfast. Tell him." He was crossing the courtyard on the way back to Gryffindor Tower when Neville fell into step beside him. Neville had been moving differently since Monday, the particular change in gait that happens when a body has been carrying something heavy long enough to forget it's carrying it and then the weight is removed. He was still quiet, still careful, but the quality of his carefulness had shifted from defensive to considered. "2 more of mine came off today," Neville said without preamble. "How's that feel?" "Like I can hear my own magic," Neville said. He was matter-of-fact about it, which was the way he said most things now, and Harry respected it. "Before, when I tried spells, it was like trying to shout through a wall. Now it's just, there." He paused. "I set the curtains of my bed on fire this morning." "On purpose?" "No. But I put them out on purpose, and that worked." He looked sideways at Harry. "Gran's going to be at the Wisengamot hearing." "I know," Harry said. "She was listed as a character witness for Dumbledore." Neville's jaw did something. "She didn't know about mine," he said. "She genuinely believed it was medical." He said this the same way he'd said it in the hospital wing, both things true at once. Not excusing. Not condemning. Holding it exactly as it was. Are you going to talk to her before? Harry asked. I wrote her a letter today. He pulled it out of his pocket, folded, sealed, his grandmother's name on the front in careful handwriting. Haven't sent it yet. He looked at it. I told her I wasn't angry at her. Which is true, mostly. I told her the binding was taken off and that I can actually do magic now without it feeling like fighting. I told her she should withdraw from the hearing. He refolded it. And I told her that if she really thought I was powerful enough to need binding, she should come watch me practice, because I think I'd like her to see it. Harry looked at him. That's a good letter, he said. Neville sent it from the Ollery. Harry watched the owl disappear into the evening sky and thought about the specific courage required to write a letter like that, not the dramatic courage of confrontation, but the quieter kind, the kind that leaves a door open when it would be easier to shut it. He thought about Snape. He thought about tomorrow morning. He was in the common room after dinner, half reading by the fire while Ron made increasingly unstrategic chess moves across from Hermione, who was not playing but had been offering commentary for 20 minutes with the academic investment of someone who had read 3 books on chess theory and was personally invested in at least one of them being relevant. You could stop him losing by taking the knight, she told Ron. It's my game, Ron said. I know what I'm doing. You're going to lose your queen in 2 moves. I know what I'm doing, Ron repeated, with the patient logic of a person who had been told a true thing they intended to ignore. Harry watched the fire and listened to them argue and let the common room move around him. Fred and George were in the corner apparently developing something that involved a piece of parchment, a small jar of something luminescent, and extremely hushed voices. Neville was by the window with his herbology notes. The fire was warm and the room was full of the low noise of people existing together, which was, Harry let himself recognize it, good. Uncomplicated. Something he was glad to have. His scar pulsed once. Very faint. A reminder. He pressed 2 fingers to it, briefly, then moved his hand. Not yet. Not until he understood it better. Not until the timing was right. You went somewhere, Hermione said. She wasn't looking at the chess board anymore. Just thinking. About Quirrell? Ron looked up sharply. What about Quirrell? Harry looked at both of them. He'd been thinking about who to tell and when, and he'd arrived at a position on it. The people who were going to be in this with him needed to actually be in it, which meant they needed to know what they were in. Sit down, he said to Ron. Ron had been sitting, but he sat more deliberately. There's someone in the castle who is carrying a piece of Voldemort, Harry said. He said the name without dropping his voice, which made both of them blink. Not metaphorically. Actually. Attached to Quirrell, most likely. The same fragment of soul situation that's in my scar, possibly in a more voluntary configuration. The DMLE knows. We're working out the timing of how to address it. Quirrell, Ron said slowly. Our defense against the dark arts teacher. Yes. Who was stuttering so hard at breakfast he spilled his pumpkin juice. The stutter may not be entirely genuine, Harry said. Ron absorbed this with the expression of someone who was revising a mental model and finding the revision made things both clearer and worse. Right, he said. You can't tell anyone, Harry said. Not because it's a secret for its own sake, but because if Quirrell knows we know, the person inside him runs. I need you to act completely normally around him. I can do that, Ron said immediately, with the straightforward confidence of someone who'd grown up in a house full of secret keepers and had calibrated his face accordingly. I can do that, Hermione said, less confidently but with greater determination, which Harry thought was probably equivalent in practice. Good. He looked back at the fire. The scar was quiet now. He's not going to stay quiet for long. Whatever Voldemort came to Hogwarts for, we're going to find out what it is before he gets it. What do you think he's after? Ron said. There's something in the school, Harry said. Below the school. Fluffy, the 3-headed dog on the 3rd floor, is guarding something. I could feel it when I walked past the corridor the first day. Whatever it is, it's magically significant. Old. He paused. And Voldemort wants it. Hermione's eyes had gone slightly wide. How do you know about the third-floor corridor? I felt it, Harry said. My core reaches sometimes. It's been doing it more since the suppressors started coming off. Like, he looked for the analogy. Like a hand in the dark, checking the edges of the room. It picks things up. Hermione was doing the cataloging thing with her eyes, the fast silent processing. Your core is actively sensing the magical environment, she said. That's advanced perception magic. Skilled adult wizards train for years to develop that kind of ambient awareness. And I've been doing it at 9%, Harry said, my whole life, without knowing what it was. He looked at the fire. I used to always know when Uncle Vernon was coming up the stairs before I heard him. I used to know when something was about to go wrong. He paused. I thought everyone could do that. I thought it was normal. The fire crackled. Ron and Hermione were both quiet. Right, Ron said finally. So we're keeping an eye on Quirrell, we're not making any moves until the timing's right, and in the meantime we're figuring out what's under the third floor. Yes, Harry said. And you have the Wisengamot hearing in 3 weeks. Yes. And you have 22 bindings still in you. Yes. Ron picked up his chess piece, set it down, and appeared to arrive at a conclusion. Fred and George want to show you something Saturday, he said. I wasn't going to mention it yet because I wasn't sure about the timing, but I think you should see it. What is it? A map, Ron said, vaguely. Of the castle. That shows everything. Harry looked at him with the particular attention of someone who understood that everything in that sentence was doing significant weight. Everything. Every person. Every room. Every passage. Ron glanced toward his brothers in the corner, who had apparently been watching and gave a pair of matching casual shrugs of deniability. Fred and George borrowed it from Filch's office in second year. They've had it since. Harry looked at the Weasley twins. They looked back with the expression of people who had just become useful and were comfortable with that. Saturday, Harry said. Saturday, said Fred, from the corner. Harry went to bed that night and lay awake for half an hour, not uncomfortably. The scars sat quiet on his forehead. His core hummed with its low warm presence. He thought about the meeting with Snape tomorrow morning. He thought about the map. He thought about what was under the third floor and why Voldemort wanted it. He thought about Hermione's theory about the fragment losing its anchor as his core expanded, and the risk of it destabilizing before it detached, and what that would feel like. He thought about what Croaker had said. I genuinely cannot predict what it will look like when you're at full capacity. He turned onto his side and watched the shadows on the wall from the moonlight through the dormitory window. At 9%, he'd survived. At 9%, he'd gotten here, to this room, to this tower, to this moment, with a sorting hat that had chosen to fight and an Auror who'd chosen to believe it and a girl who'd read until midnight and a boy who'd sent a letter to his grandmother instead of burning things down and 2 twins with a stolen map and a red-headed boy who had sat down and listened and not flinched. He thought about all of them, in the simple cataloging way, what he had, what was manageable, what mattered. And for the first time in 11 years, the inventory came back with something in the what he had column that felt like enough. Chapter 5, The Hearing. Snape was already in the empty Charms classroom when Harry arrived at 7 in the morning. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, which Harry noted as a choice. A man who dealt in power and positioning had chosen not to face the entrance, which meant he decided to make himself deliberately non-threatening, which itself communicated something. Harry came in and sat on the edge of a desk and waited. Snape turned around. He looked, in the thin morning light, exactly as he looked in classes, black robes, controlled expression, the eyes that were always doing 3 calculations at once. Except for something around the set of his jaw that was different. Something that had been worked at. You're not afraid of me, Snape said. No, Harry said. Most students are. I know. Harry looked at him. That's a choice you've made. Something moved in Snape's expression. Not offense. More like the look of someone encountering a characterization that is accurate and unwelcome. He moved from the window to a desk, didn't sit on it, stood behind it, hands flat on the surface, which was still positioning but different positioning. I knew about 2 of the bindings, he said. There was no preamble. Harry had asked for directness and Snape was apparently capable of it when it suited him. I placed them. Memory modifications, as Bones has likely told you. I placed them in Diagon Alley in June, on Dumbledore's instruction. What were you covering? Harry said. Snape's jaw moved. You saw something in Gringotts. A vault that was being emptied by a Hogwarts representative. You asked Hagrid about it and Hagrid, in his characteristic fashion, said enough that you understood something significant was being moved. He paused. Dumbledore wanted that knowledge gone before you reached the school. He believed, correctly, as it happens, that you would follow that thread. What was in the vault? The Philosopher's Stone, Snape said. Nicholas Flamel's. It is currently in this building, below the 3rd floor. He paused. You already knew something was there. Yes, Harry said. Of course you did. Snape said this without the usual acid, just flatly, tiredly. Dumbledore moved the stone here because he believed it was safest at Hogwarts. That's partially true. What he omitted from that calculation is that he invited a man he knew to be possessed by Voldemort into this school and gave him a defense position and a clear line of sight to the object Voldemort most wants in existence. Harry looked at him. You know about Quirrell. I have known about Quirrell since September 1st, Snape said. I have been, watching him. Monitoring. Attempting to determine the extent of Voldemort's presence without alerting him that I know. He held Harry's gaze and said it flatly, I am a spy, Mr. Potter. I have been one since before your parents died. I was Dumbledore's man inside Voldemort's organization for the better part of a decade. This is the context in which I placed your memory modifications, not out of malice, but because Dumbledore told me it was necessary and I had, for 30 years, operated on the principle that Dumbledore's necessity was to be trusted. And now? Harry said. The silence lasted almost 10 seconds. And now, Snape said, I am sitting in a classroom at 7 in the morning having a direct conversation with an 11-year-old boy, because I have had 3 days to think about the fact that I modified the memory of a child who was already carrying 29 illegal bindings, and the only conclusion I have arrived at is that Dumbledore's necessity and actual necessity diverged somewhere, and I did not notice it, and that is not something I can make smaller by context. Harry watched him. The firelight from the wall sconce caught the grey at Snape's temples, the deep lines at the corners of his eyes. A man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had recently been handed additional evidence of how much it weighed. My mother, Harry said. Snape went very still. You knew her, Harry said. I don't know the details. But you did. A long pause. Yes. And you're at Hogwarts, teaching, because of Dumbledore. Because of an arrangement that came from, that. Harry wasn't trying to wound him. He was stating it plainly because he needed to understand the whole shape of it. How much of what you've done for him was about her? The stillness in Snape became a different quality. The controlled professional blankness dropped just slightly, enough to show what was underneath, not a simple thing. Not guilt or grief alone, but those wound together with anger and old decisions and the specific burden of someone who had traded one form of loyalty for another and spent decades living in the space between them. Significantly more than was advisable, Snape said quietly. Harry nodded once. He sat with it. He wasn't going to forgive him this morning, he'd decided that before coming, not as punishment but as honesty, because forgiveness before he'd had time to fully understand what he was forgiving was the kind of performance he'd been unconsciously trained for and had no interest in maintaining. But he wasn't going to condemn him either, because the picture was more complicated than condemnation, and he was capable of holding complicated pictures. "The stone," Harry said. "What does Voldemort want it for?" Snape straightened slightly, shifting back into the mode that was steadier for him, the practical, tactical. "The stone produces the elixir of life. A being without a stable body, sustained by whatever dark magic Voldemort used to preserve himself in 1981, would use it to regenerate. To return fully." He paused. "He has been in this castle for 3 months and has not acted, which means either he cannot yet or there is an obstacle." "The protections on the stone," Harry said. 7 of them. Several of mine. Dumbledore set them before the term began. A beat. Quirrell can access 6. The 7th is mine, and he cannot get through it because it requires a specific kind of logic that," he paused, something briefly sardonic crossing his face. "That Voldemort, in all his genius, has never been particularly interested in. But you're the only one who can reset it," Harry said. "If Quirrell damages it trying." "Yes." "And Dumbledore is in Ministry custody." "Yes." Harry looked at the window. The morning light was strengthening, the ground starting to take on their daytime color. He thought about timing. He thought about the hearing in 3 weeks, and Quirrell watching from the hall, and the stone below them, and his own suppressors still coming off one by one in Pomfrey's careful schedule. "The hearing is in 2 weeks now," Harry said. "After the hearing, Dumbledore's status becomes either prisoner or free, and either way the political situation changes. If he's convicted, his supporters will look for other ways to act. If something goes wrong with the conviction," he paused. "Voldemort can't afford to wait for the political dust to settle. He'll move before or during the hearing, when everyone's attention is somewhere else." Snape looked at him with the expression Harry was becoming familiar with from adults in this particular position, the look of encountering 11-year-old strategic reasoning and not having a prepared response for it. "That is," Snape said carefully, "a reasonable assessment. So we need to be ready before the hearing," Harry said. "Not to confront him, not yet. But to make sure the 7th obstacle holds, and to make sure Quirrell knows there's someone watching." He looked at Snape. "Can you reinforce your protections?" "Yes." "Do it." Harry stood up from the desk. "And tell Bones about Quirrell officially. Today. She needs to know from you, on record, what you know about his possession. The investigation is in motion and your testimony about his status will be part of what protects this school." He paused at the door. "That's the right order for this one." He left. Snape stood in the empty classroom for a long moment after the door closed, then straightened his robes, picked up the small piece of parchment he'd brought and hadn't needed, and walked to the nearest fireplace to contact Bones. The days between that morning and the Wisengamot hearing moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. Academically, life at Hogwarts had a rhythm that absorbed even extraordinary circumstances, classes, meals, Quidditch tryouts that Harry didn't attend but watched with interest from the stands, the library, the common room, homework that Hermione made look easy and Ron made look like a personal dispute with a concept. Harry moved through the routine and let it ground him, because routines were useful and because being grounded was, for the next 2 weeks, a strategic necessity. The other speed was everything underneath the routine. Healer Vance came every other day. The suppressor count dropped from 22 to 17 over 10 days, and the effects accumulated not in dramatic leaps but in steady increments that Harry catalogued the way he catalogued everything, systematically, noting each change. His ambient perception sharpened. He could feel the castle's magic like weather now, a constant low presence, the oldest enchantments humming in the walls with the deep resonance of things that had been set in place before his grandparents' were born. He could feel the stone 3 floors below him when the building went quiet at night, a specific bright weight like a struck bell still ringing. He could feel the thing in his scar responding to the changes in his core, the way Croaker had predicted, a restlessness, occasional flashes of sensation that didn't belong to him. Cold rage. The particular hunger of a creature that had been half alive for a decade and was becoming more alert as the cage around the thing it was attached to expanded. He told Croaker every time it happened. Croaker noted it and said, "Not yet." The map, the Marauder's map, Fred explained on Saturday with the reverence appropriate to a holy object, was extraordinary. Harry spread it on the floor of the room of requirement, which Fred had located by accident in first year when he'd needed somewhere to hide from Filch, and read it the way you read a text in a language you somehow already know. Every person in the castle reduced to a named dot, moving through rooms and corridors in real time. He found Quirrell immediately, a dot labeled Quirinus Quirrell pacing his office in the specific repetitive circuit of someone who was either anxious or not entirely in control of their own movement. Beside it, sharing the same space, a dot with no label. Just a dot that the map had rendered in slightly different ink, darker, less defined, like something it had tried to name and found it couldn't. Harry stared at that dot for a long time. "It knows there's something there," Hermione said, from beside him. "The map. It's aware enough to register a presence but it can't classify it. So it shows it but can't name it." "Marauder's map, meet Voldemort's remnant," Fred said, from the corner. "Don't," said George. "Right." Harry folded the map. He'd memorized what he needed from it. The passages, the patrol patterns, the location of every relevant thing in the building. His core had filed it all the way it was filing everything now, efficiently, retentively, with the particular precision of a mind operating on more of itself than it had been allowed to before. The night before the hearing, McGonagall called a staff meeting that ran until midnight, and Harry, because Hogwarts was a building that had strong opinions about which conversations happened near which people, happened to be reading in an alcove off the second-floor corridor when 3 professors walked past on their way to and from the meeting. He wasn't eavesdropping. He was reading. The alcove was not his fault. He heard Flitwick saying, very quietly, "The boys' core output is increasing faster than Vance projected. I've had to restructure 2 lesson plans this week." He heard Sprout saying, "I've written to 4 families this week whose children may also have unauthorized bindings. Pomona doesn't sound frightened. She sounds angry, which is better." He heard, last and alone, McGonagall's voice from the corridor below, on what sounded like a fluke call, low, controlled, with the specific quality of someone choosing every word, "I am asking you, Albus, as your colleague of 30 years, not to speak at the hearing tomorrow. Let your counsel speak. The evidence is what it is. Your voice will only, it will make it worse. Please." A pause that went on long enough to mean the person on the other end was talking. Then, "Yes. I know what you believe. I know you believe it completely." Another pause. "That is not the same as being right." A click. The floor went silent. Harry sat in his alcove for a moment, then went back to his book, and read 3 more pages, and went to bed. He didn't sleep badly. He lay in the dark and breathed with the warm hum of his core for company and thought about nothing in particular and was asleep before he'd decided to be. The Wizengamot chamber was inside the Ministry of Magic, underground, a room that had been designed to make you feel the weight of the institution before anyone said a word. Stone-tiered seating in a semicircle, a raised bench for the Wizengamot members, a central floor where the accused and the witnesses stood, not chairs, not for witnesses, just a marked space of floor that made you aware you were standing while other people sat above you. Harry thought it was a room built to make people feel small. He stood in it and felt exactly the same size he'd felt when he woke up. The chamber was full. Not just Wizengamot members, those were in their seats, approximately 50 of them, in plum robes with the W picked out in silver. The gallery was packed. Journalists with quick quotes quills. Ministry officials. A significant number of faces Harry didn't know but whose attention he could feel on him with the specific quality of people who had opinions about what he represented. He spotted, in the gallery's 3rd row, a woman with a broad hat and a self-satisfied expression who had a quick quotes quill running at twice the speed of the others. He filed her away. McGonagall sat in the witness section to his left, spine vertical. Beside her, Healer Vance, Healer Croaker, Amelia Bones in her role as prosecuting authority, and 4 Aurors. Behind Harry, in the row above, Neville Longbottom sat with his hands flat on his knees and his toad conspicuously absent, wearing the face of someone who had practiced being in this room in their head and was finding the reality manageable. Augusta Longbottom was in the gallery, her feathered hat slightly different from what Harry had imagined but her expression exactly as he'd expected, a woman who had arrived at an uncomfortable truth and was sitting with it in public because that was, apparently, what Longbottoms did. Hermione was in the gallery with the Weasleys, Ron and his parents, who had sent Harry a letter 3 days ago that he'd read twice and kept. Mr. Weasley had written, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you're doing the right thing, and the right thing doesn't need the room to agree with it to be right." It was, Harry thought, exactly the kind of thing Ron's father would say. Dumbledore was brought in. He walked with the Aurors the same way he'd walked out of Hogwarts, measured, upright, composed. His robes were excellent. His beard was arranged. He looked, Harry thought, like a man who had decided that the hearing was a conversation rather than a judgment, which was either genuine or the most effective performance of genuine Harry had ever seen. Their eyes met when Dumbledore reached the marked floor. Harry held it. He didn't perform anything, no coldness, no defiance, no emotion for the gallery's benefit. He just looked, with the clear, direct attention of someone who understood exactly who they were looking at and had no uncertainty about it. Dumbledore looked back, and whatever he saw in Harry's face made something move briefly in his own, not guilt, not exactly, but something closer to recognition. The look of a man seeing the outcome of a plan he'd authored. The chief warlock, a thin wizard named Ogden who handled the proceedings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had run many of these and wanted this one done correctly, called the session to order. The prosecution went first. Bones stood in the chamber and did what she did best, she stated facts. The Hat's testimony, the Aurors' independent investigation, the healer's diagnostic reports, the magical signature analysis. She listed each binding, its nature, its placement date, and the confirmed signatory. She did this without rhetoric or performance. She was so straightforwardly factual that the room had no rhetorical gap to push back through for the first 20 minutes, and Harry watched several Wisengamot members do the thing people do when they can't argue with evidence and haven't yet decided whether they're going to try anyway. Then she called witnesses. Healer Vance first, on the medical specifics. Then Croaker, on the soul anchor. The chamber had a particular stillness during Croaker's testimony, even the quick quotes quills seemed to slow slightly, as if their enchantments were taking the information in carefully. Croaker spoke about soul fragments and horcruxes with the measured precision of a man who had spent his career in the Department of Mysteries and had no interest in causing panic but an absolute commitment to accuracy. By the time he was done, the room was quieter than it had been at the start. Then Bones said, "The prosecution calls Harry James Potter." Harry walked to the marked space. He was aware of the room in the specific way he was aware of everything now, all of it present, none of it overwhelming. The weight of the gallery's attention, the Wisengamot members above him, the journalists' quills, the particular quality of silence that a room of this size produces when everyone is holding their breath at the same moment. He stood straight and looked at Bones. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Can you describe, in your own words, the impact of the bindings on your daily life?" He thought about the inventory. The way he'd been doing it since he was 7. What hurts, what's manageable, what matters. He'd always thought it was just how he dealt with things. He understood now it was the mind fighting back against everything that had been put in its way. "I'll start with what I didn't know," he said. His voice was clear and reached the back of the chamber without effort. "For 11 years I thought I was ordinary. I thought the things I could feel about people and places and situations, the way I always knew when something was wrong before it happened, the way I could feel magic in things before anyone taught me magic was real, I thought that was something every person could do. I thought the reason it felt muffled, like hearing music through several walls, was just how it was." He paused. "It wasn't how it was. That was 7 suppressors on my magical core, installed before I could walk." He went through it, methodically. Not performing distress, but not sanitizing it either. The pain threshold binding and what it had allowed to happen to him without him having the appropriate alarm response. The instinct suppressor and what it had meant to live in a house where he should have known to run and instead had understood, neutrally, that the situation was survivable. The empathy dampeners and the years of feeling things he couldn't name. The loyalty compulsion and what it meant to realize that certain thoughts he'd dismissed as unimportant had been dismissed because something in him was designed to dismiss them. "I don't want to be dramatic," he said, and the chamber was completely silent. "I know what dramatic looks like and this isn't it. I'm telling you what happened because it happened, and because you need to understand that these were not incidental choices." Each binding addressed a specific capability. The suppressors removed my power. The loyalty compulsion removed my judgment. The instinct suppressor removed my self-preservation. The memory modifications removed my history. The empathy dampeners removed my ability to fully process and communicate what was being done to me. He looked up at the Wiesengemot bench. This was not protection. Protection doesn't require removing someone's ability to know they're in danger. The silence held. One of the Wiesengemot members, older, with the Dumbledore supporter look that Harry had identified in 3 others already, leaned forward. "Mr. Potter. With respect. Is it possible that some of the effects you've described could be attributed to your general upbringing rather than specifically to these bindings?" "Yes," Harry said. "And the upbringing was also a deliberate arrangement. The specific family I was placed with, over the objection of my parents' will which requested a different guardian, was chosen because they were known to be hostile to magic. The instinct suppressor ensured I would adapt to their treatment rather than resist it. The two conditions reinforced each other." He met the member's eyes. "You're asking me to choose one cause. Both causes were put in place by the same person." The member sat back. Dumbledore's counsel, a very good solicitor named Greengrass who had a reputation for intelligent argument, began the defense portion with a strategic acknowledgement. He did not deny the bindings. He couldn't, the evidence was airtight. Instead he argued intent, which was what Hermione had predicted. He argued that Dumbledore had acted under the specific and urgent context of a prophecy, that the decisions made in 1981 were made in wartime conditions, that the soul fragment in Harry's scar represented a genuine threat that required management, that Dumbledore had, in his judgment, been managing an impossible situation. "The question before this court," Greengrass said, "is not whether Albus Dumbledore made perfect decisions. He would be the first to say he did not. The question is whether decisions made under conditions of existential magical threat, with the intent of protecting the greater wizarding world, constitute criminal conduct." He was very good. Harry listened to him with respect, because good arguments deserved respect regardless of their purpose. Then Dumbledore spoke. Ogden allowed it over Bones' technical objection, on the basis that the accused had a right to address the court. Dumbledore stood in the marked space, and the room gave him the attention that his presence had always commanded and probably always would. "I will not pretend," Dumbledore said, and his voice had the quality it always had, warm, measured, the cadence of a man who chose each word with care and made the care feel natural. "I will not pretend that what I did was correct in the way that a man with more wisdom than I possess might have done correctly. I made choices that I believed were necessary. I will not hide behind intention as a shield. I understand that intention and impact are different things." He paused. "But I will ask this court to consider what was at stake. Not what was at stake for one child's comfort or power or freedom, though I understand now, more fully than I understood then, what those things meant and what their loss cost. I will ask you to consider what was at stake for every magical life in Britain." He went on. He spoke about the prophecy, about the soul fragment, about the calculations he had made. He spoke with the steady, sorrowful authority of a man confessing rather than defending, which was the most dangerous rhetorical move available to him because it looked like honesty while still being strategy. Harry listened to every word. He let Dumbledore finish. He let the chamber absorb the weight of it. Then, because he was a witness and because the prosecution had redirect rights, Bones said, Mr. Potter? Any response? He stood again. One thing, Harry said. Just one. He looked at Dumbledore, and Dumbledore looked back. You didn't do this to protect me, Harry said. You did it to protect a plan. And the plan required me to be small enough to follow it without asking questions. Those are different things, and you know they're different things, and every word you've said today has been about making them sound the same. He held Dumbledore's gaze steadily. I understand the fear that drove it. I understand the prophecy and the fragment and the impossible situation of 1981. I understand that you believed you were doing what was necessary. He paused. But understanding why someone did something isn't the same as the thing being acceptable. And I am not going to stand here and agree that what was done to me was acceptable because the person who did it had good reasons. If reasons were enough, there'd be no need for this room. The chamber was completely silent. Dumbledore said nothing. The Wizengamot deliberated for 2 hours. Harry sat in the witness section and drank tea that McGonagall pressed into his hands and watched the chamber and felt the stone 3 floors above him at Hogwarts, and felt the thing in his scar, restless and cold, and thought, soon. The vote was 31 to 19. Guilty. Not on all counts, the sole anchor charge was ruled as potentially mitigating circumstance rather than criminal in isolation, given the complexity of its nature and the evidence that it had contributed to keeping Harry alive. But on the core charges, the suppressors, the loyalty compulsion, the memory modifications, the pain threshold alteration, the growth interference. Guilty on all of those. Minimum sentencing guidelines applied. 55 years in Azkaban. Dumbledore received the sentence with the same composure with which he'd received everything else. He looked, briefly, at Harry, not with bitterness, Harry thought, and not with regret in the simple, clean way regret could look. With something more tired than that. The look of a man who had been absolutely certain for a very long time and was now holding the possibility that certainty had been his most dangerous feature. Harry held his gaze for the last time without looking away. Then the Aurors came for him, and Albus Dumbledore walked out of the Wizengamot chamber, and the room exhaled, and the gallery erupted. They came back to Hogwarts through the flue in McGonagall's office. Harry stepped out of the fireplace and the castle wrapped around him with the specific, immediate warmth of a building that was aware and had been waiting, and he stood on the hearth rug and let it settle. McGonagall came through behind him. She stood for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, then moved to her desk and sat down with the careful deliberateness of someone whose legs needed a moment. How are you? She asked. Ask me tomorrow, Harry said. Tonight I need to think. She nodded. There will be backlash, she said. The 19 who voted against, they will act. Not tonight, probably. But soon. And Dumbledore's network is, he had relationships throughout the ministry, the governors, the Order of the Phoenix. Some of those people will transfer loyalty neatly to the conviction. Some will not. She paused. Hogwarts will be fine. This school has survived worse than the removal of a headmaster. But I want you to know that what comes next may not be quiet. It hasn't been quiet since September 1st, Harry said. No, she said, and something briefly warm moved through her professional composure. It hasn't. He was almost at the door when she said, Harry. He turned. She was looking at him from behind the desk with the expression she'd worn the night he'd walked out of the hall, complicated, held, multiple components. What you said today. In the chamber. About understanding why and it not being the same as acceptable. She paused. That was, exactly right. And very hard to say. Not particularly, he said. Harder than you think, she said. When the person who hurt you also loved you, in their way. It's the hardest kind of thing to be clear about. Harry thought about that. About Dumbledore's eyes. About what the loyalty compulsion had been targeting, which had been, he understood this now fully, not manufactured love, but real feeling that existed and had been used. It had been easier to bind him to someone he already had reason to admire. The compulsion had just added weight to what was there. "I know," he said. "But clarity isn't coldness. I can understand it completely and it still doesn't make it acceptable." A pause. "Both things." McGonagall looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, quietly. "Both things." He walked back to Gryffindor Tower through corridors that were full of students having the specific loud conversations that happen after something enormous, and he walked through the noise without rushing, and Hermione met him at the portrait hole and said nothing, which was the right call, and Ron handed him a chocolate frog when he sat down, also without comment, which was equally correct. He sat in the common room and let the warmth and noise of it settle around him. His scar pulsed. Once, twice. Sharper than it had been. Not pain, not yet. Alertness. The thing in him waking up, responding to something, feeling the distance between itself and what it wanted. Harry put a hand to his forehead and breathed through it. Not tonight, he thought, at it. Not tonight. It went quiet. But he knew, with the clarity that had been building for 2 weeks as each suppressor came off and his core expanded and his perception sharpened into something that was starting to feel like a sixth sense rather than an accidental side effect, he knew it was nearly time. Whatever Voldemort had been waiting for, whatever the hearing had shifted in the political weather of the wizarding world, whatever the fragility of Quirrell's increasingly thin control over his own classroom presence was building toward, it was close now. He could feel it the way he could feel the stone, the way he could feel the castle breathing, the way he could feel everything now with the low warm certainty of a core that had been starved for 11 years and was finally, steadily, irrevocably, waking up. Chapter 6, Unbound. The scar woke him at 2 in the morning. Not gradually, it hit him the way cold water hits, immediate and total, and he was upright in his bed with his hand pressed to his forehead before his eyes had fully adjusted to the dark. The dormitory was quiet around him. Ron's breathing was steady. Seamus had kicked his blanket off in the way he always did. The regular architecture of a room full of sleeping people, completely undisturbed. Except that Harry's scar was burning with the specific quality that wasn't quite pain but was something adjacent to it, and through the burn came something else, a cold flood of emotion that wasn't his. Fury. The thin, crystalline fury of a creature that had been waiting and calculating and had finally found its moment. And underneath the fury, a sense of direction. Purpose. Movement. Quirrell was moving. Harry got out of bed. He dressed in the dark without lighting his wand because he didn't need to, his core was running warm and his eyes had adjusted and the room had its own ambient light from the moonlit windows. He tucked his wand into his sleeve and moved to the dormitory door, then stopped, turned back, and looked at Ron. He thought about it for 3 seconds. Then he crossed to Ron's bed and touched his shoulder. Ron woke the way Weasleys apparently woke, which was immediately and without confusion. He looked at Harry, read his face, and sat up. "Now?" he whispered. "Now," Harry said. Ron was dressed in 90 seconds. Harry was already at the door. In the common room, the fire had burned low. The room was all shadow and ember light, and Hermione was asleep in the armchair by the fire with a book open on her chest, which was either a coincidence or she'd been waiting, and the book was Advanced Core Mechanics and Soul Fragment Theory, so probably she'd been waiting. Harry touched her arm. She woke without the startled intake of breath that most people had, just opened her eyes and looked at him, and looked at the book on her chest, and looked at Ron, and closed the book. "Now?" she said. "Now," said Ron. She was standing before Harry had taken 3 steps. They went down through the castle in the specific quick quiet of people who had thought about this route. The map was in Harry's pocket, he'd been carrying it since Saturday, and he checked it at each staircase landing, tracking the dot that the map couldn't name as it moved through the 3rd-floor corridor with a deliberateness that said this wasn't Quirrell taking a late walk. The other dot, labeled Quirinus Quirrell, moved in perfect synchrony with it. They were the same presence now. Whatever separation had existed before between the man and what was riding him had apparently been abandoned for tonight. "He's already past the dog," Harry said, checking the map at the second-floor landing. Fluffy let him through. Ron said. Music, Hermione said, looking over Harry's shoulder. Music puts it to sleep. I found that in Hagrid's borrowing record, he checked out a book on magical creature care specifically for multi-headed dogs 3 weeks before term started. She looked up. Dumbledore set the protections, but he also told Hagrid, and Hagrid is not good at secrets, Harry finished. He folded the map and moved. The third-floor corridor had the silence of a space where something large had recently been and wasn't anymore. The door was open, not broken, just open, which meant someone with the right knowledge had played the right music and the dog had gone peacefully to sleep, and that was somehow more unsettling than a forced entry would have been. Harry went through the door, checked that Fluffy was indeed asleep in the corner with its 3 heads all tilted at different angles, and found the trapdoor. "We're going down," he said. Not a question. A statement of what was happening. Hermione nodded. Ron nodded. Neither of them looked delighted about it, which was sensible, but neither of them looked like they were going to suggest the alternative. Harry went first. The drop was further than it looked, and the devil's snare at the bottom was immediate and enthusiastic, but Hermione had read about it and said so in the crisp, clear voice of someone who was frightened and had decided that being useful was the best use of that energy, and she had her wand out and the light charm going before the plant had finished deciding to tighten, and it retreated into the walls and left them in a dark stone passage that stretched ahead in a way that Harry's core lit up. About before his eyes could see much. The stone was this way. Warm and bright and specific, a particular magical signature that sang against his perception like a tuning fork. Also this way, the cold, thin signature of the thing riding Quirrell. They moved. The chambers came in sequence. The winged keys, Harry called the right one with his core sensing the oldest enchantment on the lock rather than catching it with a broom, which Hermione and Ron both noticed and said nothing about because there wasn't time. The troll, already knocked unconscious by Quirrell and slumped against the wall with the specific profound unconsciousness of something hit with force it hadn't expected. The logic puzzle with the potions that Hermione solved in 4 minutes, which Harry thought probably represented a personal record. "There's only enough for one person to go forward," she said, looking at the bottles. "One portion." She looked at Harry. Harry looked back at her. "I know." He picked up the right bottle. "Stay here. Both of you." "Harry," Ron started. "I know where the line is," Harry said. "You don't yet." He said it without harshness. "Your job is here. Make sure nobody comes through that we don't expect." Ron pressed his jaw together and nodded. Hermione looked at him with the expression she'd worn in the library when she'd realized something about the soul fragment, that particular focused intensity that meant she'd done all the thinking available to her and had arrived at a place where she had to trust someone else. "The fragment," she said. "If it destabilizes, I'll know," Harry said. "Don't let it, I know," he said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Hermione." "I know." She nodded once, sharp and tight. He drank the potion and stepped through the black flames. The final chamber was underground in the way that certain spaces are underground not just physically but essentially, the weight of stone above and magic around, sealed, complete, like the inside of something very old and very intentional. The mirror of Erist stood at the chamber's far end, its ornate frame catching the torchlight. Harry had read about it, or heard about it, or known about it in the way he was starting to know things, through the ambient whisper of the castle's old enchantments. Quirrell stood before it. He was not stuttering. That had been a choice, Harry understood now, a costume worn in a classroom to seem harmless, abandoned the way you abandon a coat when you no longer need to pretend you're cold. He stood before the mirror with his hands at his sides, and his reflection watched him, and his face wore the concentrated frustration of a man who understood what the mirror showed and couldn't make it show him what he wanted. He turned when Harry came through the flames. He didn't look surprised. "Harry Potter," he said. His voice was different without the stutter, cleaner, lower, with a quality underneath it that wasn't entirely his. I wondered whether you'd come tonight or whether they'd manage to keep you away. Nobody manages to keep me away from things, Harry said. He looked around the chamber, reading it. The mirror. The torch brackets. The single door behind Quirrell. The specific weight of the magical object somewhere, not visible, but present, the stone tucked inside or behind or within the enchantment of the mirror. Brilliant design, actually. The mirror only showed you what you wanted. Someone who wanted to use the stone would see themselves using it. Someone who only wanted to find it would see it in their hand. Someone who wanted to find it but didn't want to use it would just see it. He moved his eyes back to Quirrell and didn't look at the mirror again. You've been quite disruptive, Quirrell said, conversationally, as if they were discussing something academic. The arrest, the hearing, the conviction. All of it moving so quickly. It's almost as if someone planned it that way. I didn't plan September 1st, Harry said. The hat did. Yes. A pause. The hat. Something moved in Quirrell's face, the flicker of a second presence, brief and dark, like a reflection in water that doesn't match what's above it. We underestimated the hat. That was an error. Though we landed exactly the way it was meant to. What do you want? Harry said. Not rhetorically. Genuinely. The stone, Quirrell said, with the directness of someone who had decided there was no point in pretense. To do what? Harry said. Regenerate. Return. I know the general plan. I mean specifically, what do you want after that? What's the version of the world you're building toward? Quirrell looked at him with slight confusion, which told Harry this was not a question Voldemort was accustomed to being asked. I want, and then the voice changed entirely. Not Quirrell's voice anymore, though Quirrell's lips were moving, something colder, more precise, with the quality of a thing that had been half alive for 10 years and remembered what it felt like to be fully present in the world. I want what I have always wanted. Power without the pretense of power. A world that is honest about what it is. You mean a world where the strong take what they want, Harry said. I mean a world where the lie stops, said the voice. The lie that love is stronger than power. The lie that sacrifice is noble rather than wasteful. The lie that people like Albus Dumbledore represent justice when they are simply a different variety of control. A pause. You of all people should understand that, Harry. He bound you. He used you. He was going to send you to die as a chess piece. Yes, Harry said. He was. And yet you helped convict him. Yes. Doesn't that make you angry? Very, Harry said. I've been angry about it for 2 weeks. It doesn't make you right. He kept his voice even and his hands still. You're not offering a better world. You're offering the same world with different people in charge of it, and I've had enough of other people deciding what I should be. He looked at Quirrell's eyes, at the dark thing behind them. You wanted me shaped for a sacrifice. He wanted me shaped for a weapon. Neither of you asked. The cold voice was quiet for a moment. You're not afraid, it said. No. You should be. I've been told that a lot recently, Harry said. It hasn't been accurate yet. The scar hit him then, not the building warmth of the past 2 weeks but a genuine strike, sharp and white, like a blade going in, and Harry felt it the way he felt everything now, fully and completely, and did not step back. His core flared in response, not in pain, in the reflex of something that had been fighting the same intrusion for 11 years and was finally doing it with its full weight behind it. Quirrell raised his wand. Harry raised his. What came out of his wand was not Expelliarmus. He knew that was the right spell, the proportionate spell, the spell you were supposed to use, but the spells you're supposed to use come from training and calibration and careful incremental practice, and Harry had 17 suppressors still in him and his core had been starved for 11 years and it had opinions about the thing that had been living in his head all that time, and what came out of his wand was something bright and total that hit Quirrell's wand hand and sent the wand spinning into the far wall and knocked Quirrell back 3 steps. Not a spell with a name. Just magic. Direct. His. Quirrell looked at his hand. Looked at Harry. His expression had gone through surprised and landed somewhere that was almost curious. Your power, he said, and it was both voices at once, is larger than we expected. 17 suppressors to go, Harry said. I'm at about 40%. Give or take. The dark presence inside Quirrell processed this. Then it moved. Not Quirrell. Quirrell was a vessel, had been a vessel since Albania, was increasingly not Quirrell at all anymore. The presence that had been riding him detached itself from the pretense of operating through a human body and acted directly, which was something it could do when it had enough will and enough desperation and nothing left to lose by being seen. A cold wave of intent that hit the room like a drop in temperature. Harry felt it touch his core. Felt it try to grip the soul fragment. Felt the fragment respond, lurch toward the call of its source, the way iron filings respond to a magnet, and felt his own core respond to that, which was the thing that the past 2 weeks of suppressor removal had been building toward without anyone quite naming it directly. His core, expanding. The fragment's anchor, thinning. Hermione's theory, which was apparently correct. The fragment didn't belong here. His core knew that now in a way it hadn't been able to know before, because before it had been too suppressed to have strong opinions about anything. Now it had very strong opinions. The fragment was wrong signature, wrong temperature, wrong origin, a piece of something that had tried to destroy him and instead latched on, and his core was no longer the small, dim, bounded thing that the fragment had attached to at 14 months. His core was not that thing anymore. He didn't try to force it. He didn't reach for the fragment or push at it or do anything that Healer Croker had described as intervention. He simply stood in a chamber and let his core be what it was, warm, full, expanding, himself, and the cold presence of Voldemort's will wrapped around the fragment and the fragment pulled toward it, and the bond between the fragment and Harry's core stretched and the pain was extraordinary. He'd been warned about it. He kept his feet. And broke. The sensation of it was like a held note reaching its end. A pressure that had been present every moment of every day of his entire life, so constant that he'd never known it was there, releasing all at once. Not violent, the opposite. The specific relief of a thing that was never supposed to be there finishing its terrible stay. The fragment didn't go quietly. It went the way things go when they lose their anchor and have nowhere to land, with the cold fury of a creature suddenly without a home, lashing outward in all directions. The mirror of Erist cracked down the middle. The torch brackets melted. The stone floor developed a spidering network of fine fractures radiating from the point where Quirrell stood. Quirrell collapsed. Not dramatically, just suddenly, the way a puppet goes when the strings are cut. He folded to the floor and lay still, and the shadow that had been riding him, without a body, without the fragment to orient toward, without the stone and without Quirrell's compliance, was simply a cold darkness searching for somewhere to go. It came at Harry. Harry stood still and let his core meet it, and his core was 40% of what it had been meant to be all along, woken and warm and completely, absolutely, his own, and the cold darkness hit it the way a wave hits a cliff, with force, with fury, with all the terrible weight of a will that had spent decades refusing death. And broke against it. Not destroyed. Harry understood that, Voldemort was not destroyed, would not be destroyed by this, was something that required more than a single evening in a chamber below a school to fully end. But broken, scattered, dispersed, sent back to whatever thin half-life he'd been sustaining himself on in the forests of Albania, without a body, without a host, without the stone. The cold left the room all at once. The silence that followed was the silence of a room that has been the site of something immense and doesn't quite know how to return to ordinary acoustics. Harry stood in it for a moment, both hands at his sides, breathing. His scar was quiet. Not burning, not pulsing, not the low constant warmth it had been for weeks. Just, quiet. A scar. A mark on his skin that was nothing more than it appeared. He looked at Quirrell on the floor. The man was alive, breathing, pulse present when Harry checked, but deeply unconscious in the way of someone whose body has been thoroughly used by something it wasn't designed for. He needed medical attention. He needed it soon. Harry looked at the mirror of Erist, cracked down its center, the inscription along the top still legible on both halves. He looked at the stone, which had appeared in his hand during the fragment's departure without his quite having asked it to, the mirror's final enchantment working exactly as designed, giving the stone to the person who wanted only to find it. He turned it over once. A small, unremarkable red stone that was somehow the most significant object in a room that had contained multiple significant objects tonight. He closed his fingers around it, turned away from the mirror, and walked back through the flames. Ron and Hermione were in the potion chamber when he came through, and both of them looked at his face before they looked at anything else, and both of them made the involuntary physical adjustment of people who had been very tense for an undetermined period of time and could now stop. "Done," Ron said. "Done," Harry said. He opened his hand, showed them the stone, closed it again. "Quirrell's down. He's alive but he needs Pomfrey. I need to get this to Bones tonight, not McGonagall, not the Ministry switchboard, directly to Bones." "Dumbledore's convicted," Hermione said. "There's no one to pass it back to." "I know." Harry was already moving toward the trapdoor. "That's why I want Bones. She'll know what to do with it that isn't," he paused. "It needs to stop existing," he said. "It's a resurrection stone without the resurrection. It's an elixir without the elixir. It's a reason for bad people to do terrible things to get it. Bones can ensure it's destroyed properly." Hermione looked at the closed fist. "Flamel," she said. "Nicholas Flamel. It's his. He's 665 years old," Harry said. "He'll understand." She opened her mouth. Closed it. "You're right," she said, which cost her something, the giving up of someone else's extraordinary object, but she gave it up cleanly. They went back up through the chambers, the potion room, the chess room where the pieces were still in post-game positions, the troll, the key room, and up through the trapdoor where Fluffy was still asleep with 3 sets of jaws gently snoring, and out into the 3rd-floor corridor, and up through Hogwarts' familiar dark. It was 3:30 in the morning. The castle was asleep. The stones were warm, the torches low, the portraits slumbering in their frames with the particular indignity of painted subjects who had been drawn sleeping and resented it. Harry walked through it all and felt the building around him in the full reach of his perception, every old enchantment, every ward, every layer of magic built up over 1,000 years, felt it the way you feel your own heartbeat when the room goes quiet enough. He felt the hat, on its shelf in the headmistress's office, aware and awake. He felt something in the school that was different now from what it had been an hour ago, something like a held breath finally released, the castle itself, old and opinionated and entirely aware of what had just happened in its basement, settling into a different configuration. Less waiting. More itself. McGonagall was in her office. She hadn't slept. She was at her desk in her dressing gown with a lamp lit and a cup of tea gone cold, surrounded by correspondence she hadn't been reading. She looked up when they came through the door and took in Harry's face, and Ron's face, and Hermione's face, and the way Harry was holding his fist. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He told her. Concisely and fully. She listened without interrupting, and her face moved through several expressions in quick succession and landed on the one he'd come to recognize as her crisis management face, not calm, but controlled, which was better. "Quirrell," she said, and was already standing. "Alive," Harry said. "He needs Pomfrey now." She sent a Patronus, a cat, obviously, and was reaching for the Floo powder when Harry said, "I need Bones' personal Floo address." She paused. Looked at him. Looked at his closed fist. "She's going to want to hear this tonight," Harry said. "And I need this thing out of my hand and in the right custody before morning." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with the expression she'd worn at the hearing, the one with multiple components that she'd been sorting through for 3 weeks. Then she opened her desk drawer, took out a small address card, and handed it to him. "Tell her I sent you," she said. He threw the powder and called the address. Bones Flew was in her home office, which was organized with the same methodical efficiency as every other aspect of her professional existence. She was awake. He had the sense she slept badly during active investigations and that this investigation had been very active, and she came to the fireplace in her dressing gown with her monocle still in, which told him something about how she dressed for sleep. "Mr. Potter," she said, in the voice of a woman who had been expecting some version of this call and was still slightly surprised to be receiving it at 3:30 in the morning. "Quirrell has been dealt with," Harry said. "Voldemort is dispersed, not destroyed, dispersed. He'll be back eventually but not soon and not here." He opened his fist. Held it up to the Floo. "I have the stone. I need to give it to someone tonight who will ensure it's destroyed. Not stored. Not locked away. Destroyed." Bones looked at the stone through the green fire for a long moment. "That stone," she said carefully, "belongs technically to Nicholas Flamel." "I know," Harry said. "I'll write him a letter. But if it still exists tomorrow morning it's a liability. Flamel has lived 665 years off it. He'll adapt." He held her gaze through the fire. "You know I'm right." Bones was quiet. Then, "Come through." He stepped through the Floo. She took the stone from his hand and held it in her palm and looked at it with the expression of someone holding something that represented a great deal of history and had already decided what to do with it. She wrapped it in a containment cloth she summoned from her desk, opened a small lead box, and set it inside. "I'll take it to the Department of Mysteries in the morning," she said. "Personal custody. Croaker will oversee the destruction." She closed the box. "Proper channels." "Good," Harry said. She looked at him. "You went down there yourself?" "Yes. You should have told us." "There wasn't time," Harry said. "Quirrell moved tonight because the political situation had shifted and the window was closing. If I'd gone for help first, he'd have the stone and we'd have nothing." He met her eyes. "I did tell you, I told you 3 weeks ago that he'd move around the hearing. You knew." A pause. "I didn't authorize you to." "No," Harry agreed. "You didn't." He was not apologetic about this. "I'm 11 years old. I don't need authorization to protect myself from something that's been in my head since I was 14 months old." Bones looked at him for a very long time. "You," she said finally, "are going to be either the best thing that has ever happened to the wizarding world or the most exhausting." "I expect both," Harry said. At the same time. Something moved in her expression that was undeniably, briefly, a smile. "Get back to the school," she said. "Sleep. I'll be at Hogwarts by 7 for Quirrell." He went back through the Floo. He was back in the dormitory before 5. He'd walked through the castle on the return, not hurrying, just walking, and let himself feel it. The building around him. The quiet. The steady warm presence of his core, running fuller and cleaner than it had ever managed before, the fragments absent something he was still adjusting to the way you adjust to silence after a long noise. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment. His hands were steady. His scar was quiet. His magic was humming along at something he estimated was 42%, maybe a little more, which was still not what it would eventually be, still 17 suppressors to go, still months of Healer Vance's careful work ahead. But 42% of himself was more himself than 9%, and he had been 9% his whole life and he had already done so much from there. He thought about what the hat had told him. The earliest bindings were placed at 14 months. He thought about the prophecy. Neither can live while the other survives. Which had never required his death, he understood now, it had required Voldemort's. The fragment in his scar had been Voldemort's final anchor, the last piece of his soul tethered to the world, and with it gone, truly gone, what Voldemort was sustaining himself on in the forests and dark places of the world was whatever remained of a soul from which pieces had been torn 6 times. Less than a whole soul. Less, probably, than could sustain a human form without the stone's help. The prophecy hadn't needed him to die. It had needed him to live fully enough that the fragment couldn't hold on. He lay back on the pillow. Dawn was beginning its first gray suggestion at the window's edge. The dormitory breathed around him, Ron and Seamus and Neville, the ordinary sound of people sleeping without knowing what had happened in the rooms below their feet. Neville. He thought about Neville's letter to his grandmother, which Augusta Longbottom had apparently read 3 times and responded to with a letter of her own that Neville had read equally carefully and shared nothing of with anyone, but whose effect could be measured in the way he stood in the common room now, slightly more space taken up, slightly more deliberate. The remaining bindings would come off one by one over the next several months. Healer Vance had a schedule. His core would continue to expand, continue to recalibrate, continue to be more. He would continue to learn what he actually was, uncaged, unscripted, unmanaged. He thought about Dumbledore. He did this the way he'd been doing it since the hearing, not with the loyalty compulsion warping the picture, not with the empathy dampeners keeping the complexity at arm's length, but directly, fully, both things. The man had been brilliant. The man had been genuinely afraid. The man had believed, completely, that the small managed suffering of one child was a reasonable price for the safety of an entire world, and the man had been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong about that, and both of those facts about him were real and coexisted. Harry was 11 years old and he understood this with a completeness that surprised him, that he suspected would continue to surprise him as he grew older and understood more about what had been done and why, because the why would never stop being complicated and the wrong would never stop being absolute. He could hold both. He was getting better at holding both. He closed his eyes. He was almost asleep when the hat's voice came, not in his head, not the close private voice of the sorting, but from below, from the office 3 floors down, the hat on its shelf, doing what the hat apparently did in the small hours when the castle was quiet and the things it had been watching had finally moved. It laughed. A low, dry, ancient sound that moved through the building stones the way old enchantments move, everywhere at once, unavoidable, resonant. Not triumphant. Not gloating. Just, the laugh of something very old that had been waiting a very long time for a very specific thing and had finally got to see it. Harry smiled at the ceiling. 3 days later, he was in the courtyard with Hermione and Ron and Neville when the owl arrived. It was a handsome bird, grey, efficient, with the posture of an owl that had been somewhere far and had opinions about it. It landed on the bench beside Harry and extended its leg with the businesslike manner of a professional courier completing a delivery. The letter was addressed in an antique hand, the ink a slightly unusual shade, the parchment thick and old in a way that genuine age rather than affectation produced. Mr. Potter, I am told that you came into possession of a certain item and made a certain decision regarding its disposal. I am 665 years old. I have, I confess, been reconsidering the question of permanence for some decades. Perenelle and I have quite enough elixir to put our affairs in order. I am not writing to dispute the decision. I am writing to say, well done. Furthermore, I have been in correspondence with Madame Bones regarding certain aspects of your situation that were brought to my attention. I have some knowledge of binding mechanics that dates to rather earlier than the current standard literature, and I would like to offer my assistance to Healer Vance's ongoing work, if you are willing. I expect the remaining 17 will take considerably less time than projected. Yours, Nicholas Flamel. Harry read it twice. Looked up at Hermione, who was reading it over his shoulder. He wants to help, she said, and her voice had the specific quality it got when something exceeded her research expectations. Yes, Harry said. That's 6 centuries of practical knowledge that isn't in any current text. Hermione, Ron said. You're excited because Harry's bindings might come off faster. I'm also excited because of the academic access, she said, unapologetically. There she is, said Ron. Neville was reading the letter now, and his expression had the open quality it had been getting more of lately, less guarded, more present, the face of a person learning that the world sometimes responds to them as well as the reverse. "Will you write back?" he asked. "Tonight," Harry said. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket and looked at the courtyard, at the school around them, the towers, the lake catching the September light, the mountains beyond, the whole enormous comfortable reality of the place that had chosen him before he'd arrived, the hat that had been waiting for him, the castle that had breathed out when the fragment left. His core hummed. Warm. Clear. His. "Come on then," Ron said, and stood up from the bench with the easy authority of a boy who had decided something and needed it confirmed. "Fred and George want to show us something in the 7th floor corridor. They won't say what it is, but they've been insufferably pleased with themselves since breakfast." "That's their default setting," Harry said. "More than usual," Ron said. "Which is alarming." They went, the four of them, across the courtyard and into the building, through corridors that Harry walked with the particular awareness of a person who knew every stone of them, not through years of familiarity, but through perception, through the castle's own language of old magic and older intention, which spoke to him steadily now and had been speaking to him all along. He was a month into Hogwarts. He had 22 fewer bindings than he'd had when the hat spoke. He had the morning's warmth on his face and friends at his shoulder and the letter of a 600-year-old man in his pocket and a scar that was quiet for the first time in his life. He had a very long way to go. He understood that. The Wizengamot had to be rebuilt, piece by piece, into something that served justice rather than power. The 19 who had voted against conviction were still active and organized and would continue to be. Voldemort's dispersal was not his destruction and would not be permanent. The Order of the Phoenix had fractured and some of its members were handling that fracture badly. There were, somewhere in the world, more Horcruxes. He didn't know that word yet, but he would, and when he did, it would make sense with a terrible clarity. He knew that ahead of him were things that were going to require more than he currently had. More knowledge, more practice, more time, more of himself becoming what he'd been prevented from becoming for 11 years. He was not afraid of any of it. He was, at 42% of what he was supposed to be, already the thing that Dumbledore had spent a decade making sure he wouldn't be. By the time the last suppressor came off, whenever that was, Flamel willing, sooner than projected, he had no idea what that would look like, and found that he wasn't the right person to ask. He was the wrong person to predict himself. He was the right person to be himself, finally, at last. The twins were at the top of the 7th floor corridor with matching expressions of barely contained satisfaction, and whatever they'd found was behind the blank stretch of wall across from the tapestry, and it was already beginning to be clear that it was something remarkable. "Ready?" said Fred. "Yes," said Harry. He meant it in every direction it could be meant.